"My lord, please get up. Your brides are waiting." Dan opened his eyes and saw a pair of unfamiliar hands, long, pale, with calluses from a quill. The last thing he remembered was the headlights of a truck in his windshield. And now he's a penniless lord in a medieval world, and in an hour he's supposed to get married, to 3 women at once, the sick one, the cursed one, and the unlucky one, the ones no one else would take. An old man in a rumpled doublet, reeking of sour wine, is shaking him by the shoulder. Dan sits up. His head is throbbing with pain. It's not his head. It's not his body. Someone else's memory answers before he has a chance to ask. 3 names surface like lines from a stranger's diary. Leanne Mervyn, Isolde Corvin, Caitlin O'Brien. All 3 were sent to the Ashford estate because no one else would take them. And he, Daniel Ashford, 22 years old, the last heir to a destitute family, is taking all 3 as his wives today. Dan closes his eyes. He opens them. The cobwebs on the ceiling haven't disappeared. This isn't a dream. The old man's name is Oswald, and on the way to the hall he hurriedly fills Dan's head with what his memory couldn't hold. The Ashford estate lies on the southern border of the kingdom. 5 generations ago they were wealthy. Now they are destitute. The lands have been mortgaged. Of the servants, only Oswald himself and the cook remain. The marriage board sent the 3 brides by decree. No other house agreed to take them in. The board sought a lord poor enough and desperate enough to take all 3 as a package deal. And here he is. In a doublet the color of yesterday's sky, washed in river water for 3 years running. They enter the hall. It is empty, with that kind of emptiness that comes when the furniture has been sold and no new furniture has been bought. 30 guests line the walls, having come to watch the Ashfords bury their family name. 3 figures stand at the altar. Dan looks at them and freezes. The first on the left, thin. Her dress hangs on her like a coat on a hanger. She coughs into a handkerchief and clenches it in her fist so no one will see what's left on fabric. Leanne Mervyn, 20 years old, sick. Dan reads her body instantly. Severe anemia, malnutrition, bluish discoloration under her fingernails, breathing through her mouth. Because Dan Hahn was a general practitioner in that life. The second one in the center, straight as a spear, a black veil down to her chin, gloves up to her elbows, not a single patch of exposed skin. Isolde Corvin, 23, cursed, disowned by her family at 16. She isn't just standing straight, she's rigid, like someone who's grown accustomed to being struck and has decided to meet the blow standing tall. The third one stepped back on her own, fair-haired, smiling, politely, automatically. Dan had seen that smile hundreds of times, on children in foster care who'd learned to be easy to handle so they wouldn't be sent back. Caitlin O'Brien, 19, unlucky. 4 broken engagements, 4 dead or ruined fiancés. Everyone is convinced she brings bad luck. Dan looks at the 3 women and understands. Each of them has already decided that they won't be chosen again today. Leanne hides behind a cough. Isolde hides her face. Caitlin hides behind a smile. They aren't expecting anything good. They've braced themselves for the worst. The priest begins the ritual about blood and duty, and then a voice rings out from the back row. Marcus Ashford, the cousin. He leans toward his neighbor loud enough for the whole hall to hear. I wonder in what order he'll take them to the bedroom. Someone snorts. Leanne clutches her handkerchief tighter. Caitlin's shoulders shudder, but her smile holds firm. Dan takes the wedding cup. The priest waits for him to drink and pass it around. It's the custom. Dan puts the cup back down. He turns to the 3 brides. He takes a step toward them, and he speaks, quietly, so that only they can hear. My name is Dan. I know you're scared. Tonight, no one is going to force anyone to do anything. We're just going to get to know each other. Okay. Leanne looks up for the first time during the entire ceremony. Beneath the coughing and pallor, there's something alive. Frightened, but alive. Isolde, beneath her veil, freezes. She doesn't relax. She freezes. Like a dog that's heard an unfamiliar sound and can't decide whether to bite or listen. Caitlin stops smiling. She just stops. And beneath the mask is the face of a very tired 19-year-old girl who has walked down the aisle 4 times and walked away alone 4 times. Dan takes the chalice. He drinks. He passes it around. The priest recites the incantation. 3 thin white threads flare up above the altar. The threads of kinship, the bond between spouses. Usually, they flare up and fade away in the very same moment, because kinship demands something that hasn't existed in the kingdom's marriages for 100 years. Everyone expects the threads to fade. The threads do not fade. 3 white lines hang above their heads, pulsing slowly, quietly, stubbornly, vividly. The hall falls silent. The priest freezes with his mouth agape. Marcus stops smirking. Oswald turns pale and presses his hand to his chest. Dan doesn't understand what's happening. He sees the threads but doesn't know what they mean or why everyone is staring as if lightning had struck the chapel. He knows only one thing. The 3 girls are standing side by side, and not a single one is crying. A good start. The guests disperse quickly. No one stays for dinner, which at the Ashford house consists of thin soup and bread that doesn't even remember last week. According to custom, the Lord determines the order of the first wedding night. Oswald waits for instructions. Dan speaks. Each one goes to her own room, separately. Dinner in an hour. I'll bring it myself. Oswald opens his mouth to object. Dan repeats himself. Oswald shuts his mouth. Dan goes down to the kitchen. He takes a whole chicken. A knife. His hands don't remember how to handle a knife, but his head does. His grandmother in Seoul taught him to make broth when he was 9. Bones in cold water, low heat, a whole onion. For Leanne, he makes a separate batch, thicker, with bone marrow that he scrapes out with a spoon shard, with onions caramelized to a golden brown so that a person with a lost appetite would find it easier to eat. While the broth simmers, he goes from room to room. He moves Leanne from the damp north to the dry south, where there's no draft. He finds a second blanket for Isolde and hangs a curtain the entrance so she has 2 layers between herself and the world. Caitlin's room has already been washed and tidied, by herself. In the 20 minutes that have passed since the wedding, she put the place in order and sat down to wait. The broth is ready. Dan brings it to Leanne first. There's a knock. She answers with the voice of someone who has been waiting for that knock all evening and dreading it. He enters. Leanne is sitting on the bed in her nightgown. The blanket is clenched in her fists. She's ready. Ready for what she imagines is about to happen. Dan sets the pot on a chair and sits down on the floor, at the foot of the bed, below her eyes. Never stand over someone who's waiting for a blow, he asks quietly. 3 questions. When was the last time she ate meat? When was the last time she slept on her side? And has anyone ever made broth just for her? Not for the whole family, just for her, in a small pot. Leanne is silent for a long time. Then she answers with a single word. Never. Dan lifts the lid. Steam rises toward the ceiling. This is yours. No one else will eat from it. Leanne takes the pot with both hands. Her hands are shaking. She takes her first sip, and the thread of kinship above their heads flares up, not faintly, not subtly, so brightly that shadows dart across the walls. Someone in the hallway drops a candle. Dan doesn't understand what happened. He just sits on the floor and watches as Leanne drinks in small sips. She finishes it. She lies down. She closes her eyes. A minute later, she's asleep. For the first time in a long time, she falls asleep not with fear, but with warmth in her stomach. Dan covers her with a second blanket. He slips out quietly. He takes dinner to the others. Isolde takes the bowl through the crack in the door without taking off her gloves or saying a word. Caitlin thanks him 3 times and smiles 4 times in a minute. Dan returns to the kitchen. He rests his head in his hands. He's dead. He's alive. He's in a strange world, in a strange body, with 3 wives he met just 3 hours ago. He knows nothing of magic, nothing of maps, not even where the bathroom is. But Leanne has fallen asleep without fear, and that's a good start. And in the morning, old Oswald will discover that the Ashfords' neglected south garden has turned green overnight. Oswald stood in the middle of the south garden and looked like a man who'd just been told that his dead cat had returned and brought a mouse. Grass was pushing through the stony ground. The 3 apple trees, which hadn't borne fruit in 8 years, were covered with pale buds. The rose bush by the fence unfurled its leaves as if waking from a long sleep. Yesterday, this had been dead ground. Today, it was alive. Oswald touched the grass, real, wet with dew. He looked up at Dan, who was standing nearby in the same doublet he'd worn yesterday, because he didn't have another one. "My lord, what did you do last night?" Dan looked at the garden, then at his hands, then back at the garden. He had no idea. He'd made some broth. That was all he'd done. Oswald explained. Kinship in the marriage bond is not just threads above one's head. It is a connection between the home and the land. When kinship grows, the land responds. Harvests improve. Livestock grows healthier. Springs become clearer. When the kinship wanes, the land withers. The Ashfords hadn't seen a living kinship in 3 generations. Everyone thought their line had died out. And then, overnight, the south garden. Dan listened. He nodded. He filed the information away in that part of his mind he called the madness folder. That was also where he'd filed the first stories from teenagers at crisis centers when they described things that made you want to run out of the room. Don't leave. Listen. You'll figure it out later. He told Oswald they needed to talk. But first, he needed a complete list of everything in the house. Food, money, people, debts, everything. Oswald led him into the study. The study was a room with a single table and a chair missing a leg. There were papers on the table, lots of papers. Dan sat down. Oswald began to speak. The picture that emerged was one that, back in Boston, Dan would have called a Category 3 crisis. The funds in the treasury would last a month and a half at best. The debt owed to Count Valrod was an amount that made Dan's teeth ache just thinking about it. 4 villages were listed as belonging to the Ashford estate, but 2 of them hadn't paid taxes for the past 2 years because they had nothing with which to pay. The retinue had been disbanded. The last soldier had left a year ago. All that remained of the estate were 6 chickens, 1 cow, and a stable hand without a horse. Dan listened and jotted down notes on a scrap of parchment. Not numbers, people. Who worked in the house? Who lived in the villages? Who was sick with what? Who held a grudge against whom? Who had left and why? Oswald was surprised by the questions. Lords usually asked about income and taxes. This one asked about people. Dan finished with Oswald 2 hours later. Then he went to check on his wives. Leanne was still asleep. He peeked in quietly. Her complexion looked slightly better than yesterday. Or maybe he was just flattering himself. He left a jug of boiled water by the bed. Isolde didn't open the door. He knocked. He called through the door that breakfast would be in the hall in half an hour. She replied that she wasn't hungry. Her voice was steady and cold as the ice on the north-facing window. Dan didn't press the matter. He said he'd leave the food by the door. Caitlin was already in the dining room. She'd found a rag and was washing the table. When Dan walked in, she straightened up and smiled. He looked at her hands. They were red from the cold water. Chapped. She'd been washing dishes since morning. He said good morning. She said, "Good morning, my lord," and that she was very sorry the table was dirty and had decided to clean it up. Dan sat down across from her. He asked if she'd eaten. She said yes, of course, everything was fine. Dan looked at her. Back in Boston, he'd had children who would say, "Everything's fine," even when they hadn't eaten for 2 days. The same voice, the same smile. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and returned with 2 bowls of porridge. He sat down across from her and began eating his own. The porridge tasted awful. Bertha cooked it with the enthusiasm of a dead fish. But Dan ate. Caitlin watched. Then she picked up a spoon. She ate quickly and neatly, like someone used to eating fast before it was taken away. Dan noticed. He didn't say anything. They ate in silence. It was the first silence that didn't feel oppressive. After breakfast, Dan made a decision. He needed the full picture. Not the house, the people. He asked Caitlin for a favor. He didn't order her. He asked. He said he needed someone who could count and keep records, that he'd seen her clean the room in 20 minutes and the dining room before breakfast, and that someone with such a sense of order was surely good with numbers. Caitlin froze. Her smile faltered for a second, and something genuine flashed beneath it. Surprise. He asked if she could keep the household expense ledger, if it was convenient for her. If not, he'd understand. Caitlin said yes so quickly that she startled herself. Then she added more quietly, "My father taught me arithmetic and business correspondence before he died." After that, no one needed her to do the math. All anyone wanted was for her to leave and not bring trouble. Dan nodded. He said she didn't need to leave here. Here, they needed her numbers. He gave her some paper, a pen, and Oswald's list. Caitlin sat down at the table with the look of someone who'd been handed a treasure. Dan went to his old. The bowl by the door was empty, a good sign. He didn't knock. Instead, he sat down in the hallway across from her door and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. He said he didn't know what had happened to her. He said he wouldn't ask until she was ready to talk. He said there were 3 things in the house that belong only to her: her room, her silence, and her right not to come out until she's ready. The silence behind the door was different. Not hostile, attentive. He continued. He said the only thing he asked was that she eat 3 times a day. He would leave food at the door, hot, and if she needed anything specific, she could write a note and slip it under the door. Silence. Then, from a scrap of paper slowly slid out from under the door. On it, in handwriting as even and stiff as her back, was written a single word: candles. Dan nodded toward the door. He found 4 candle stubs in the pantry. He placed them by the threshold. A minute later, a gloved hand took them. He left. The day went on. Dan methodically walked through the house, mapping it out in his head. Not the walls and rooms, the people and their problems. The kitchen. Bertha was a poor cook, but it wasn't her fault. There wasn't enough food. There were no spices at all. The dishes were cracked. The knives were dull. Dan sharpened 2 of them. Bertha looked at him as if he were a ghost. Lords don't sharpen knives. This one did. The pantry. Flour and salt. A barrel of salted fish. Dried herbs, half of which were useless and the other half potentially poisonous. Dan separated one from the other. He found something that looked like thyme. He sniffed it. He hung it up to dry again. The well. The water was murky. Dan told Oswald to boil all the water before drinking it. Oswald asked why. Dan said that unboiled water was home to tiny creatures that caused stomach sickness. Oswald looked at him as if he were crazy, but he nodded. The Lord said to boil it, so boil it. By evening, Dan was back in the kitchen. He was cooking. Not broth, porridge, with onions, with that root vegetable, with a piece of salted fish for flavor, a separate portion for Leanne, a thin porridge, made with broth instead of water, with extra salt. Bertha stood nearby and watched. Then she asked if she could help. Dan handed her the onion. She chopped it. For the first time in a year, someone was cooking in this kitchen as if it actually mattered. Dan brought in dinner. Leanne had woken up. She was sitting on the bed. She saw him and didn't flinch. Yesterday she'd flinched. Today she didn't. He set the pot down. He sat down on the floor. Leanne looked at him and asked why he was sitting on the floor. He answered honestly. Because when a person is scared, you need to be below their eye level. That way, it's less threatening. Leanne was silent. Then she said quietly that she wasn't scared. She just felt strange. No one had ever thought about where to sit next to her before. Dan nodded. He said that now someone was thinking about it. Leanne picked up the bowl. She began to eat. More slowly this time. Not greedily. More calmly. The thread of kinship shone evenly and warmly above them. Dan saw it out of the corner of his eye, but still didn't fully understand what it meant. He just saw that Leanne was eating, and that her complexion was a little better than yesterday. That was enough. He stood up. He said good night. Leanne said good night. No title, just good night. Dan walked out and stopped in the hallway. 2 days. He'd been in this world for 2 days. He had no money, no army, no magic. He had a dilapidated house, a cook who couldn't cook, a manager who drinks, a stable hand without a horse, 3 wives, one of whom is dying. The second won't leave her room. The third smiles so widely that you can't see the person behind the smile, and a south-facing garden that's turned green from chicken broth. Dan leaned against the wall. He closed his eyes. The voice of his Boston supervisor, Dr. Pack, rang in his head. She always said the same thing when a case seemed impossible. You can't save everyone in a single day, but you can do one thing right, one thing every day. Dan opened his eyes. One thing for tomorrow. He knew what it was. In the morning, he would go to the village. The village of Ashbrook lay an hour's walk from the estate and looked as if someone had started building it, then changed their mind and walked away. A dozen houses, half of them with sagging roofs, a well in the square. Dan walked along the only road and counted the faces. 23 people had come out to look at the young lord. 23 faces, all with the same expression. Wariness. He knew that look. He'd seen it in foster families when a new social worker arrived. People didn't believe that a lord's visit could mean anything other than a new tax or a new order. Oswald walked beside him. Behind them, 10 paces back, walked Caitlin. Dan had asked her to come along, not because he needed help, but because she needed to get out of the house. She walked with the expense ledger tucked under her arm and a smile that faded slightly when she saw the village. Not out of disdain, out of recognition. She herself had lived like this for the past 2 years, ever since her father's death. The village headman of Ashbrook was a sturdy man named Graham. His face was tanned, his hands were calloused. His eyes looked at Dan as if calculating how much he could charge him for the visit. Graham bowed just enough to satisfy custom, not a degree less. Dan asked him to show him around the village. Graham did. Dan walked and asked questions, not the kind of questions lords ask. Lords ask how much grain has been harvested and why taxes haven't been paid. Dan asked about other things, how many children were in the village. 18, Graham replied. How many are sick right now? Graham hesitated. 6. With what? Graham didn't know. Stomach problems, all the same thing. It's been 3 weeks already. Dan asked to see the well. Graham led him to the well. Dan looked down. He asked for a bucket of water. The water was murky and smelled sour. He asked for a torch. Oswald found one. Dan lowered the torch into the well and looked at the walls. On a ledge 4 meters from the surface lay something dark, thing, small, dead, a dead rat. It had fallen into the well at some unknown time and had been decomposing in the water everyone had been drinking. Dan straightened up. He looked at Graham. He said calmly, "The children aren't sick from a curse or bad air. They're sick from the water. There's a dead animal in the well. We need to clean out the well. Boil all the water in every house, and don't drink raw water until the well is clean." Graham looked at him for a long time. Then he asked, "How does the young lord know this?" Dan replied, "Because rotting flesh in the water poisons it. It's not magic. It's a law of nature." Graham exchanged glances with those standing nearby. They neither believed him nor disbelieved him. They were simply waiting. Dan didn't try to convince them with words. He took off his doublet, rolled up his sleeves, asked for a rope and a bucket, and set about cleaning the well himself. Oswald grabbed his arm. "My lord, you mustn't." Dan looked at him and asked who else would do it. Oswald opened his mouth, then closed it. Dan climbed into the well. Graham stood above, looking down with an expression Dan couldn't see, but Caitlin did. She later described it in her book in a single line. For the first time in 10 years, Graham didn't know what to think of his lord. Dan cleaned out the well. He pulled out a rat, 2 handfuls of rotten leaves, a piece of cloth of unknown origin. He climbed out, dirty and wet. He asked them to build a fire. He showed them how to boil water. He explained it simply. Fire kills whatever is making your stomach sick. Water is safe after it's been over the fire. Wait until it cools down. Drink only that kind. Graham listened. He nodded. Then he said, "But what if the Lord is lying and we're wasting firewood for nothing?" Dan said that if the children weren't better in a week, he'd personally bring more firewood from the estate to replace it. Graham nodded again. This time it was different, like a man who'd heard not a promise but a wager. The Lord had staked his reputation on his words. That much was clear. Dan walked further through the village. He went into houses. He asked questions, not about how much grain they had, but how the children were sleeping, what they were feeding them, and when the doctor had last visited. At first, people answered briefly, then more at length. One woman showed him a child with a rash on its arms. Dan took a closer look. It wasn't an infection. It was contact dermatitis. He asked what she used to wash the laundry. She showed him the soap. The soap was harsh and smelled of lye so strongly that Dan's eyes watered. He told her to rinse the laundry twice, better yet, 3 times, and not to rub that soap directly on the child's skin. The woman looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language, but she nodded. Caitlin walked beside him and took notes. Every house, every complaint, every problem. Her handwriting was small and neat. She wrote with the seriousness of someone who'd been given a real job for the first time. They returned to the estate by evening. Dan was dirty and tired. Caitlin was dirty and wasn't smiling, for the first time that day. That was good. Real emotions are better than a polite mask. At the estate, news awaited him. Leanne came out of the room, on her own, without help. She made it to the kitchen. Bertha found her sitting at the table, holding a cup of water. She was just sitting there, holding the cup. Bertha was startled and wanted to take her back. Leanne said she wanted to sit there. Bertha didn't know what to do with the Lord's wife who wanted to sit in the kitchen, so she left her be. Dan found 8 with Leanne there. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his dirty clothes. She asked quietly. He'd been cleaning the well. Dan nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, she had heard him talking to Oswald that morning about boiling water and tiny creatures that cause illness. She wanted to know more. Dan sat down at the table. He began to speak, simply, without technical terms, about how there are creatures living in water and food that are too small to see with the naked eye, that they cause disease, that fire and cleanliness kill them, that washing your hands before eating and before touching wounds isn't a whim, but a form of protection. Leanne listened. Her eyes changed. Something appeared in them Dan hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, interest. She asked, "What if these creatures are in the wounds? Does that mean the wounds rot not from a curse but from dirt?" Dan looked at her. In Boston, he would have said he was looking at someone with a natural clinical mind. Here, he said, "Yes, exactly." Leanne nodded slowly, like someone who had just been given the key to a door she'd thought was boarded up. She'd been surrounded by illness her whole life, her mother, then her own body. Doctors came and went, talking about bad blood, family curses, and the weakness of her lineage. Not once had anyone mentioned water or creatures that could be killed by fire. This was something new. It was something she could understand. Dan saw his chance and didn't let it slip away. He asked if she wanted to help him, with the sick, with the village, to figure out which of the illnesses around them were real and which could be cured with cleanliness and food. Leanne didn't answer right away. She stared into her cup. Then she said she didn't know if she could. She was sick herself. What good would she be? Dan said the one thing he knew better than anything else in the world, that it is precisely the one who has been sick who best understands the one who is sick now, that her experience isn't a weakness, it's knowledge. Leanne looked up. The thread of kinship shimmered quietly and steadily above her. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She said, "Let him tell me more. About the creatures, about purity, about everything. Dan talked until dark. Bertha brought them dinner and stood in the doorway listening. She didn't understand everything either, but she understood the main thing. The young lord knows something that no one else knows, and the sick girl who was brought here to die is listening to him as if she wants to live. That night, Dan lay in his room and thought. 2 days ago, he had died on a highway in Massachusetts. Now he lives in a world where marriage is a magical contract and the well once in a generation. He has one girl who's starting to believe him, one who sits outside the door and burns candles, one who writes down his every word with an accountant's precision and hides an ocean behind her smile. A village where today he removed a dead rat from the well, and that was the most useful thing Lord Ashford had done for his people in 10 years. A garden that's turning green because he made broth. He rolled onto his back. The room was dark. The thread of kinship flickered faintly above him. One thread, to Leanne. The other two were dim, almost invisible. But they hadn't gone out. They were waiting. On the 4th day, Isolde came out of her room. Not because she wanted to, because Dan had dropped a pot of porridge right outside her door, and the porridge had spilled across the hallway with a sound that was impossible to ignore. Dan stood over the puddle of porridge and thought that in Boston, he hadn't dropped anything heavier than a pen in 7 years. It was clumsy. The door opened. Isolde stood in the doorway, without her veil. Dan saw her face for the first time. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, sharp cheekbones, thin lips pressed into a line that said the whole world owed her, and she'd remembered it. Her gloves were still on. She looked at the porridge, then at Dan, then back at the porridge, and she said, "Is this my breakfast or my punishment?" Her voice was dry, sharp, with a knack for sarcasm that develops when humor is the only weapon they haven't taken away from you. Dan said it was breakfast. It had been. Now it was a natural disaster. He apologized and promised to bring her a new one. Isolde stood in the doorway and didn't close it. It was an invitation, a small one, a cautious one, like a window left slightly ajar that would slam shut at the sound of a loud word. Dan didn't go in. He sat down in the hallway right in the porridge and began wiping the floor with a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. Isolde looked down at him. Her lord and husband was sitting on the floor in a puddle of porridge, wiping the hallway. She said, "You have servants for that." Dan replied that there were 3 servants and they were all busy. Bertha was cooking. Oswald was tallying the debts. The stable hand was repairing the fence. There was no one else. Isolde was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then you're the most pathetic lord she's ever seen." And she said it without malice, more out of surprise. Dan agreed. He said that perhaps she was right. She stood in the doorway for another minute. Then she stepped out into the hallway. She helped lift the pot, with her gloved hands, without touching it. They carried the pot to the kitchen in silence. Isolde entered the kitchen. Bertha saw her and took a step back. Oswald, the steward, who had come in for water, froze in the doorway. Everyone in the house knew that the lord's second wife was cursed, that her touch brought madness, that she had been disowned by her family for witchcraft. Isolde saw their reaction. Her back straightened even further. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes turned icy. A shell. Dan recognized it instantly. A person anticipates rejection and puts up a shield before they can be hurt. Back in Boston, he dealt with teenagers who'd walk into a room with their arms crossed and the phrase, "I don't care," on their lips before anyone even opened their mouth. Dan turned to Bertha and said calmly, "Lady Isolde will have breakfast in the kitchen. Give her a clean bowl and a spoon." Bertha handed them over. Her hands trembled slightly, but she handed them over. Isolde sat down at the table. She removed one glove, the left one. The hand beneath it was pale and slender, with long fingers, a perfectly ordinary hand. Bertha stared at the hand as if she were expecting snakes to crawl out of it. No snakes came out. Isolde picked up the spoon and began to eat, silently, with the dignity of someone eating porridge in a stranger's kitchen and pretending it's a palace breakfast. Dan sat across from her. He was eating too. Silence. Caitlin walked in 5 minutes later. She saw Isolde at the table. She smiled, but not with a hollow smile, a different one, with cautious joy. She sat down next to Isolde, not too close, at arm's length. It was the right distance. Dan noticed and thought that Caitlin sensed people better than anyone in this house, including him. Breakfast was over. Isolde stood up. She put on a glove. She looked at Dan and said, "She wouldn't sit in a room all day. She wasn't disabled or a prisoner. If he had work for her, she would work." Dan thought, work. He had a to-do list 3 parchments long. But what kind of work is suitable for someone who can sense lies and people's intentions just by touch, and who, without any training, goes mad from it? He asked. "She reads and writes well." Isolde looked at him as if he'd asked whether a fish could swim. She was the daughter of House Corvin, one of the oldest houses of the North. She read and wrote in 3 languages. Dan nodded. He asked her to sort through the Ashford archives. The study was cluttered with papers, contracts, letters, IOUs, and land deeds. No one had touched this mess in years. If Isolde could sort through and organize it, it would be a huge help. Isolde nodded, briefly. She went into the study. Dan heard her open a desk drawer and mutter a curse under her breath at the mess. It was a good sound. A person who curses at disorder is a person who has decided to fight it. The day was spent working. Dan established a schedule in the house, a simple one. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 7 in the evening, meals in the kitchen. Everyone together. Anyone who didn't want to come didn't have to, but the food would be hot and waiting. Oswald expressed doubt that it was fitting for a lord to eat in the kitchen with the servants. Dan replied that in a house with only 4 people, there was no point in dividing people into lords and servants at the dinner table. Oswald washed down his doubts with wine. But he came to dinner. Bertha came. The stable hand, whose name turned out to be Olaf, came. He was a huge, silent man with hands like shovels and eyes like a sad dog's. He ate a lot, and in silence. Leanne came, on her own, slowly, holding onto the wall. But she came. She sat down next to Dan and sipped her broth in small sips. Caitlin came in first and set the table, without being asked, simply because she saw what needed to be done and did it. Isolde came in last. She sat at the end of the table. She ate with her gloves on. She didn't take them off. But she came. 6 people at the table, in the kitchen. The first shared dinner at the Ashfords' home in years. No one talked much. Bertha asked if they liked the porridge. Leanne said she did, quietly but honestly. Bertha beamed. Olaf asked for seconds. Caitlin offered to wash the dishes. Isolde silently stood up and helped clear the table. Her left glove was off. The right one wasn't. A small step. Dan didn't mention it out loud, but he made a mental note. After lunch, Isolde called him into her office. She had been working for 4 hours and had sorted through 1/3 of the archive. The papers lay in neat stacks: contracts, letters, debt documents, land deeds. In a separate stack lay the papers she had marked as important. Dan picked up the first one. A contract between the Ashford family and the Valrod family. A debt. A large one, with interest that grew every quarter. A condition. If the debt wasn't paid by the end of the current year, the Valrods would gain the right to the Ashfords' southern lands. Those very southern lands on which stood the garden that had just begun to turn green. Dan read it. He read it again. He looked at Isolde. She nodded. She had read it too, and she understood as well. They had 8 months to pay off the debt or lose the only land that had begun to yield life. The second document was more interesting. An old letter, 20 years old, from Dan's father to someone in the capital. The handwriting was slurred and uneven. The content, a plea for help, a mention of some family documents proving that the Ashfords were entitled to debt relief. The documents were not attached. There was no reply to the letter. Dan asked Isolde if she knew what documents were being referred to. Isolde shook her head, but she added that she would keep looking. Dan thanked her. Isolde looked at him strangely, like someone who'd been thanked for doing what they considered ordinary. She said, "He's a strange lord. He's thanking me for work I'm supposed to do as a wife." Dan replied, "Supposed to and wanting to are two different things. He's thanking you for wanting to help." Isolde turned away, quickly. But Dan managed to notice that her expression lost its armor for a second. Just for a second. Then the armor returned. But the crack remained. That evening, Dan was making broth for Leanne again. Bertha stood nearby, and this time she wasn't just watching. She was repeating after him. Dan explained, "Bones in cold water, low heat, don't boil it, simmer it. A whole onion adds sweetness, salt at the end." Bertha nodded and committed it to memory. She didn't know how to write it down on paper, but her memory for recipes was better than that of any chef Dan knew. He gave her a task. Tomorrow morning she would make the broth herself, following his recipe, for Leanne. Bertha sat up straight, her shoulders squared. She'd been given a task, not an order. A task. With trust. It worked. It always worked. In Boston and in Underline. People don't want orders. People want someone to say, "I trust you." That night, Dan sat on the porch. He looked out at the south garden. The buds on the apple trees had opened, pale, small, but alive. The bond with Leanne glowed steadily. The bond with Caitlin had grown slightly brighter than yesterday. The bond with Isolde was dim, barely noticeable, but it hadn't gone out. Dan closed his eyes. 8 months until the debt was due. A village with sick children. A home without a wife. 3 wives. 3 wounded people. And the land that responds to the broth. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in 4 days, he had a feeling he remembered from his toughest cases. The feeling that there was something here to work with. A week had passed. The children in Ashbrook were no longer sick. Graham didn't come to thank him. He sent a sack of turnips. For the village elder, that was more than a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. A sack of turnips is worth a lot when you don't have enough food yourself. Bertha accepted the sack and grumbled that she didn't know 20 ways to cook turnips. Dan knew 3. They started with soup. The house was changing, slowly, imperceptibly to those who didn't know where to look. But Dan knew. Bertha started making broth herself in the mornings, without being reminded. She got up earlier. She cleaned the kitchen before work. Her porridge was still tasteless, but the broth turned out well. Olaf fixed the fence. Then he fixed the shutter in Leanne's room. Then he painted the kitchen door. No one asked him to. He just saw that people around him were working and started working too. Oswald stopped drinking by lunchtime. He still drank by dinner, but by lunchtime he was sober. For a man who'd been drinking from morning till night for the past 5 years, that was progress. Dan didn't praise him for it out loud. He just gave him tasks that required a clear head in the morning. Oswald understood without words. Leanne was changing faster than anyone else. Broth, clean water, a warm, dry room, sleep. Dan monitored her diet with the precision of a clinician. In the morning, porridge made with broth and a pinch of salt. At noon, bread soaked in broth. In the evening, broth with boiled chicken. Small portions. Frequently. 6 times a day instead of 3. Leanne ate without complaint. She understood why. Dan explained everything to her. Every meal. Why the salt? Why the small portions? Why the bone marrow? She absorbed the information with the eagerness of someone who had been told her whole life that her body was broken, and for the first time, someone was explaining how it worked. By the end of the first week, she could walk from her room to the kitchen without holding on to the wall. The bluish discoloration under her fingernails had faded slightly. She coughed less often. Not that it had stopped, but less often. One morning, Dan found her in the kitchen with Berta. Leanne was explaining to the cook why the broth needed to be simmered rather than boiled. Berta listened. Leanne spoke quietly but confidently. Those were Dan's words, but the tone was hers. She wasn't repeating them. She was teaching. Dan stood in the doorway and felt what he felt every time his charges in Boston began to help others. Pride. Not for himself, for her. Caitlin kept the books. It wasn't just good, it was brilliant. In a week, she had organized all the household expenses into a system that Dan could show to any 21st century auditor without shame. Every penny accounted for. Every expense was justified. Every line item was signed off on. She found 3 places where the farm was losing money for no good reason. Overpaying for salt from a middleman, rent for pasture land that no one had used in 2 years, and a regular payment to the capital for a fair license that the Ashfords hadn't held since Dan's grandfather's time. Caitlin brought him these figures and stood beside him with a smile on her face. But her eyes were different. They held anticipation. She was waiting him to say that she'd done something wrong, that the numbers were wrong, that she'd made a mistake, that her attention to detail was excessive and unnecessary, because that's what she'd been told her whole life. Dan looked at the numbers. He looked at her, and he said, "Caitlin, you just saved the company 2 months of its life." She blinked. Her smile vanished for a second. Then it returned. But it was different. Not a polite smile, a real one, a small one, with the corners of her lips trembling. She said quietly, "It's true," Dan said. "It's true." Caitlin nodded, turned away, walked out. Dan heard her stop in the hallway, breathing heavily. She wasn't crying. She was holding it back. Then, with steady steps, she walked to her room. The thread of kinship. With Caitlin grew brighter, not in a flash, as it had with Leanne, a slow, steady glow. Dan began to notice that things around her broke less often. The kitchen stool that had been wobbly for a month suddenly stood steady. The candle that always smoked now burned cleanly. Little things. But in a world where bad luck was her curse, little things meant everything. Isolde worked in the study, every day from morning till night. She had sorted through the entire archive. Every document had been read. Every one had been organized. She had drawn up a complete map of the Ashford estate's debts and obligations. The picture was grim but clear. A debt to the Valrods, a small debt to 3 merchants, 2 years' worth of unpaid taxes. The land deed for the Northern Grove was in question. Those very mysterious papers Dan's father had written about were never found. But Isolde found something else, a letter, an old one, not from Dan's father, from his grandfather, addressed to the marriage council. The contents, a request to verify the Ashford family's bloodline, a mention of some ancient rite connected to the first kings. The college's response. The request was denied. No explanation given. Isolde showed the letter to Dan. They were sitting in the study. A candle burned between them. Isolde said, "Someone on the council didn't want the Ashfords to know anything about their lineage." Dan asked what she thought. Isolde looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "She thinks that 3 brides in the poorest house in the kingdom is no coincidence. She thinks that the sick girl, the cursed one, and the unlucky one ended up in the same house because someone wanted them to be right here, in a house that was meant to rot away, along with them." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. Not a magical chill, just the ordinary human chill that comes from realizing someone had been manipulating the lives of these 3 girls like pieces on a chessboard. He asked if she had any proof. Isolde said no, not yet, but she would look for it. She said it with a calmness that Dan recognized. It was the calmness of someone who had found a purpose, not for him, but for herself. Isolde wanted to know the truth, not because Dan had asked, but because it was her story too. She had been disowned. She had been exiled. And if someone's scheme was behind it, she wanted to know whose. The thread of kinship with Isolde stirred. For the first time in a week. Dimly, barely perceptibly, but Dan saw it. He didn't say anything. He just stood up and offered her some tea. The tea at the Ashfords was weak and tasteless, but hot. Isolde took the cup, with her left hand, without a glove. Dan noticed. He didn't look. He sat down and drank his tea. They sat in silence. two people in a dimly lit study. Between them burned a candle, and a silence that, for the first time in a week, wasn't a wall but something more like a bridge. The next morning, Dan made a decision. He needed income. Urgently. 8 months until the debt to the Valrods was due. Caitlin had cut expenses to the bare minimum, but minimal expenses without income meant a slow death. He needed something that would bring in money quickly, using what he had. And he had the south garden, which was green out of season. He went out into the garden. The apple trees were in bloom, in early fall, when not a single apple tree in the kingdom is in bloom. Dan stood beneath the trees and thought. The magic of kinship makes the soil fertile. The southern garden yields a harvest out of season. Apples in winter aren't just food, they're a luxury. If he could grow a crop by winter and sell it when no one else has apples, the price would be high. He found Oswald. He asked if there was a market in the nearest town. Oswald said there was. Crosstone, half a day's journey, a fair every week. Dan asked how much apples cost in winter. Oswald named the price. Dan did the math. If the southern orchard yielded even an average harvest, and they could preserve and sell it in the winter, that would be enough to pay off their small debts. Not Valrod's, but 3 merchants. And that's a breath of fresh air. He went back inside. He gathered everyone around the kitchen table. Bertha, Oswald, Olaf, Caitlin, Leanne, who came on her own and sat next to Bertha, and Isolde, who arrived last and sat at the end of the table. And he said he wanted to establish a family council. Once a week. Everyone who lives in the house would sit down at the table and discuss what's going on, what's needed, what isn't working. Everyone has a say. Everyone, including Bertha and Olaf. Oswald asked, "Even the servants?" Dan said, "There are no servants here. There are people who live under the same roof and work toward a common goal." If Olaf has an opinion on how to fix the fence, his opinion is more important than Dan's because Olaf knows about fences and Dan doesn't. Olaf looked up from his bowl. He looked at Dan, for the first time ever. There was something in his eyes that Dan had seen in hospices, in patients who were being asked for the first time how they wanted to spend the time they had left. An acknowledgement. That you're here, that you matter, that you're seen. Olaf said, "The fence on the east side needs to be completely replaced. The posts have rotted." Dan said, "Thank you." Olaf nodded and went back to his food, but his shoulders seemed to have broadened slightly. Caitlin offered to take the minutes of the council meeting. Dan agreed. Isolde said she had a list of questions regarding the archives that required the Lord's decision. Dan asked her to read them aloud. She read them. 7 questions. Dan answered 3. He postponed 2. He didn't know the answers to 2 and honestly admitted that he didn't know. Isolde looked at him. A lord who says he doesn't know. She added that she might be able to find the answers if she were given access to the library at Crosstone. Dan said, "Of course." The first family council at Ashford Manor lasted 40 minutes. 3 issues were resolved. 2 new ones were raised. Bertha complained that she didn't have enough knives. Olaf said he could forge a knife if they could find some metal. Caitlin took notes. Leanne listened and said nothing. But she was there, at the table, among the people. And when the council ended, she didn't leave right away. She stayed and helped Bertha clear the table. Dan went out into the courtyard. He looked up at the sky. The 3 threads of kinship glowed, one brightly, one evenly, one dimly. But all 3 were alive. And above the south garden, the autumn air smelled of apple blossoms. The first month had ended, and Leanne was back on her feet. Not figuratively, literally. She stood in the estate's courtyard in the morning light and breathed deeply, not through her mouth, through her nose, for the first time in years. Dan watched from the porch and took stock. Her complexion, pale but not gray. Her gums, turning pink. Her pulse at her neck, calmer than a month ago. The bluish tint under her fingernails had almost disappeared. She was still thin. She still got tired quickly. But she was standing in the courtyard, breathing, and it was a miracle that Dan had built with broth and clean water and a warm blanket and 6 meals a day. Leanne turned to him. She said she wanted to go to the village. Dan asked why. She replied, Graham had sent a note. His wife had given birth to their 3rd child. The baby was weak. The local midwife said she didn't have enough milk. Leanne wanted to go take a look. Dan thought about it. In Boston, he would have said the patient wasn't ready for such exertion. But Leanne wasn't his patient. She was his wife. And for the first time in a month, she wanted something. Not because someone had asked her to, not because she had to, but because she'd decided for herself. He said, "All right." But they walked together, and slowly. It took them an hour to walk to Ashbrook. Leanne stopped 3 times to rest. She didn't complain. She just sat down on a rock and breathed. Then she got up and kept going. Graham was waiting for them in the village. His face was somber. He led them into the house. His wife was lying on a bench with the baby. Tiny, red, crying quietly, not a loud cry, but that thin whimper that means there's no strength left to scream. The midwife stood nearby, shaking her head. She said the baby was weak from birth and that there was nothing to be done. Such is fate. Dan looked at the baby, then at the mother. Pale, sweaty, dry lips. He recognized the symptoms instantly. Dehydration. The mother isn't drinking enough water and her milk isn't coming in. Plus, she's likely lost blood after giving birth. A classic situation where, in the 21st century, they'd give her an IV drip of saline solution and everything would be resolved within a day. He didn't have an IV drip, but he had knowledge. He turned to Leanne, and instead of doing everything himself, he asked, "What does she see?" Leanne looked closely at the woman, for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Her lips are dry. The skin on her hands doesn't smooth out when you pinch it. Her eyes are sunken. She isn't drinking." Dan nodded. He asked what she thought they should do. Leanne paused. Then she said, "Water, lots of water, with salt, maybe honey if we have any, so the water stays in her body." Dan smiled, not on the outside but on the inside. She had described oral rehydration in her own words, without a textbook, without any medical training, just by observing and thinking. He said, "Exactly. Show me how you do it." Leanne froze. She looked at him. She'd expected him to do it himself, that she would just watch, to learn, but he was asking her to do it. She turned to Graham. Her voice wavered on the first word but steadied on the second. "She needs clean water, boiled water, salt. If there's honey, then honey. A clean cloth." Graham looked at her, then at Dan. Dan nodded. Graham went to get water. Leanne stayed with the woman in labor. She sat down beside her, took the woman's hand, told her quietly that everything would be all right, that she just needed to drink, a lot and often, in small sips, that her body knows how to make milk, but it needs water to do so. The woman looked at her, a thin girl in a dress that still hung on her like a sack. But her voice was calm and confident, and the woman began to drink. Leanne stirred the salt and honey into the water. She gave her a drink every 10 minutes, in small sips, just as Dan had given her a drink a month ago. By evening, the woman had stopped trembling. The milk came that night. The baby finally cried out at the top of her lungs, and Graham stepped out of the house with tears in his eyes and stood in the yard, gazing up at the sky. Dan and Leanne to the estate after dark. Leanne walked in silence. She was so tired that Dan carried her on his back for the last quarter of the way. She didn't resist. She rested her head on his shoulder and breathed evenly. She was almost asleep. Caitlin was waiting for them on the threshold with a candle. She saw Leanne on Dan's back, and for a second her smile became genuine, frightened but genuine. Dan said that Leanne was just tired, that everything was fine. Caitlin helped tuck Leanne in and brought her some water. She covered her with a blanket. Dan stood in the doorway and watched as one of his wives tucked in the other. Something was changing in the house. Not between him and them, between them. The thread of kinship with Leanne burned brighter than it ever had. But Dan noticed something else. Something was glowing between Leanne and Caitlin, too. Not a thread, not magic. Something invisible and warm. Maybe it was called friendship. The next morning brought a problem. Oswald came to breakfast with the face of a man who'd swallowed a hedgehog. He said one word: Marcus. Cousin Marcus Ashford had sent a letter, an official one, with a seal. The contents. Marcus, as the closest male relative, expressed concern about the state of the Ashford estate. He points out that the young lord has not performed a single traditional confirmation ceremony. He has not accepted vassal oaths. He has not conducted a survey of the lands. He has not presented his wives to the Earl's court. Based on the foregoing, Marcus intends to file a request with the Matrimonial College to review Lord Ashford's legal capacity. Dan read the letter. He passed it to Isolde. Isolde read it. Her eyes narrowed. She said, "Marcus isn't a fool. He's gathering grounds for a lawsuit. Every point in the letter isn't a complaint. It's preparation for a future trial. If Dan doesn't respond formally, Marcus will use his silence as evidence." Dan asked what she suggested. Isolde said, "Reply, formally, politely, addressing each point. And add that Lord Ashford would be happy to welcome his cousin to the estate for a private conversation. That will shift the burden to Marcus. If he comes, they'll see his face. If he doesn't, his letter loses its weight." Dan looked at her. At that moment, she wasn't the damned girl in gloves. She was a strategist. He said, "Write the reply." "She'll write it. He'll sign it." Isolde nodded. She went into the study. An hour later, she returned with a letter that was as smooth as silk and as sharp as a knife. Every word was carefully chosen. Every turn of phrase was flawless. Dan read it. He didn't understand half the legal jargon of this world, but he understood the tone. The tone said, "We see what you're doing. We're not afraid. Come on over." He signed it. The letter was sent by the stable hand, Olaf, who had to walk because there was still no horse. Dan decided that a horse was the next expense, after the apples. Caitlin did the math. If the apples from the south garden ripened by the first snow and they managed to get them to the fair in Crosstone, the proceeds would cover 3 small debts and leave enough for a horse. If. Dan went into the garden. The apple trees were in full bloom, strange and beautiful, an autumn garden in bloom. Butterflies that shouldn't be around at this time of year fluttered above the trees. The ground beneath his feet was soft and warm. He placed his hand on the trunk of an apple tree. The bark was warm, alive. The thread of kinship with Leanne pulsed somewhere at the edge of his vision. The earth gave because he gave to Leanne. Leanne gave because he had given her broth, knowledge, and the right to be useful. A circle, closed and growing. Dan understood the system. He had worked with systems his whole life. A family is a system. A community is a system. Resources flow where there is trust. Trust grows where there is care. Care works only when it is genuine. The system rejects the fake. He stood in the garden and thought about the Valrods, about duty, about the 8 months, about Marcus, about the college and the capital. The world around him was hostile, but the world inside the Ashford house was beginning to breathe. By the end of the second week, something happened that Dan hadn't expected. He was cooking dinner in the kitchen. Bertha had gone to the village to visit her sister. He was alone. He was chopping an onion. He was crying from the onion. That's the only reason therapists cry in the kitchen. The door opened. Isolde walked in, without knocking. She never knocked. She walked in as she had the right to, because she did. She stood beside him. She looked at the onion, at the tears, at the knife. Then she said, "You're cutting it wrong. You have to cut an onion from the root. That way there are fewer tears." Dan looked at her. She knew how to cut an onion. She was the daughter of a noble family, and she knew how to cut an onion. He asked how she knew. Isolde paused. Then she said, After her excommunication, she lived in the temple for 2 years. Everyone worked in the temple, even the excommunicated, especially the excommunicated. She cleaned, she washed, she cooked, she did laundry for 2 years, until a letter arrived from the college stating that she was to be married off to the Ashford family. She fell silent. Dan waited. He didn't rush her. He didn't ask questions. There's a rule in therapy. When a person stops in the middle of a story, don't push them. Wait. If they want to continue, they will. If not, that's an answer too. Isolde continued. She said it was quiet in the convent, that it was the only place where the voices in her head fell silent, because the nuns spoke little and felt even less, or had learned not to feel. Dan asked cautiously, "The voices?" Isolde looked at him, directly, without a guard up, for a single second. She said she could hear people, not words, intentions. When someone is near her, she senses what they truly want, what they're thinking, what they're hiding. The closer they are, the louder it gets. A touch is a scream. That's why the gloves. That's why the veil. That's why the renunciation. Because at 16, at a dinner party, she turned to her father's friend and said aloud everything he was hiding. Everything. Dan didn't ask what exactly. It didn't matter. What mattered was that a 16-year-old girl had been broken because she couldn't control a gift that no one had explained to her. He put down the knife, turned to her, said, "She isn't cursed. What she feels has a name." Not here. But he knew. It's called hypersensitivity to emotional signals, and it can be controlled, not eliminated, controlled. There are techniques. He could teach her if she wanted to. Isolde looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "He's the first person in 7 years who hasn't called it a curse." Dan replied, "Because it's not a curse. It's a tool you haven't been taught how to use." Isolde lowered her eyes. Then she raised them. There was something wet in them. She quickly turned away. She picked up a knife. She began cutting an onion, from the root, without tears. They cooked dinner together, in silence. The thread of kinship with Isolde became visible, thin, uncertain, but real. Dan began teaching Isolde grounding techniques in the 3rd week. In Boston, he'd used them with teenagers who were overwhelmed by other people's emotions at school. Here, he applied the same principles, but adapted to a world where no one had ever heard the word psychology. He called it the craft of silence. Every morning before breakfast, they would sit in the study. Dan explained, "When other people's intentions start echoing in your head, you need to find your own body. Feet on the floor, weight on the chair, breathing. Air enters through the nose and exits through the mouth. This is your anchor. As long as you feel your own body, you won't drown in someone else's." Isolde listened skeptically. For the first 3 days, she said it was nonsense, that she'd tried praying and meditating in a temple, and nothing had worked. Dan explained the difference. Our prayer is directed outward, toward God, toward a higher power. Grounding is directed inward, toward yourself. Not toward something big, but toward something small. The sensation of the floor beneath your feet, the texture of the wood on the table, the scent of a candle. Isolde gave it a try. On the 4th day, she said she could feel the difference. When Berta walked into the kitchen in the morning, Isolde usually sensed everything the cook was feeling. Fatigue, irritation with the cat, anxiety about the flour supply. It all came crashing down at once, and Isolde couldn't separate her own feelings from Berta's. After 4 days of practice, she was able to step back for a second, to feel the floor beneath her feet. And that split-second pause was enough for the voices to grow quieter. They didn't fall silent, but they grew quieter. Isolde looked at Dan with an expression he recognized. That's what people look like when they first realize that their pain can be lessened. Not eliminated, lessened, and that even this reduction changes everything. She said, "More. Teach me more." Dan taught her, every morning, 30 minutes. He explained to her the difference between her own emotions and those of others. Your own feelings come on slowly. They build up. They have a reason that you know. Other people's feelings come on suddenly, without a reason, without context. If you're sitting there calmly and suddenly get angry and don't know why, that's not your anger. It's someone nearby. Isolde soaked it all in. She was smart, sharp and ruthlessly smart. She asked questions that made Dan think. Once she asked, "What if the person next to me is feeling the same thing I am? How can I tell my own anger apart from theirs if we're both angry?" Dan admitted it was a good question, one of the best he'd ever been asked. In Boston, that would have taken a month's worth of work. Here, he explained it more simply. The body. Your anger lives in your body. In your clenched teeth. In your clenched fists. Someone else's anger lives in your head. Like a sound. Like noise behind a wall. Learn to distinguish between what's a sound and what's a sensation. Isolde tried. She made mistakes. She tried again. By the second week of training, she was able to sit in the kitchen with everyone and not flinch every time Olaf's mood shifted. And Olaf's mood shifted often. He was a quiet man with a turbulent inner world, and before, Isolde hadn't been able to stay near him for more than 5 minutes. Now she could. A small victory. But she changed her lunchtime routine. Isolde began staying at the table until the end. While Dan worked with Isolde in the mornings, the rest of life at home didn't come to a standstill. Caitlin went to Croston, alone. Dan suggested Oswald accompany her, but Caitlin said she could manage. She rode in a wagon that Olaf had put together from the remains of 2 old wagons. Graham lent her the horse. Caitlin rode to the market with a sack of early apples from the South Garden and a book in which she had recorded all the apple prices for the past year. She checked the prices with Oswald. She verified them with the merchant who brought in salt. She cross-checked them against the records in the archives. Dan hadn't asked her to do this. She did it on her own. She returned in the evening, without apples, with money, with 2 sacks of flour, with a piece of fresh guilt, and with an expression on her face that Dan had never seen before. Not a smile, not a mask. Calmness. The quiet, confident calm of someone who had gotten the job done and knew they'd done it well. She said, "Apples in Crosstone cost 3 times as much as usual. Because they're not supposed to be in season in the fall. The merchants didn't believe the apples were real. One took a bite to check. Then he bought the whole sack. A second merchant asked if there would be more. Caitlin said there would be. Every week. As long as the orchard produces them." She signed a contract for 3 future deliveries, with prepayment. Dan looked at the numbers she had written down. Then he looked at her. He said, "You've entered into a futures contract." Caitlin didn't know that word, but she knew she'd done the right thing. Dan explained, "You sold goods that don't exist yet at a price you locked in right now. That means that even if prices drop by winter, they'll get the amount we agreed on. And if they go up, they can enter into new contracts at the new price." Caitlin wrote down the word futures in her notebook. She underlined it. The thread of kinship with Caitlin grew brighter, not in a flash, but with a steady, sustained glow. Dan noticed something else. On the way to Crosstone, the wagon didn't break down. The horse didn't go lame. The weather didn't turn bad. Not a single stroke of bad luck. Before, every trip Caitlin took was accompanied by minor disasters. Something would break. Someone would get sick. Something would go missing. Not this time. Her shield gift was changing. Not because Dan had done anything to it directly, but because, for the first time in her life, Caitlin was doing something not out of fear, but by choice. She went to the market because she wanted to help the household, not because she was afraid of being useless. The difference was subtle, but the magic of kinship sensed subtleties better than people did. The second month. Apples from the southern orchard were sent to Crosstone every week. Money trickled in, a thin stream, but it flowed nonetheless. Caitlin paid off the first of 3 small debts. The merchant received the coins and looked at the Ashford seal with surprise. This household hadn't paid its debts in 3 years, and suddenly it was paying. Dan, meanwhile, was working with the villages, not just with Ashbrook, 4 villages were under the Ashford Estate's jurisdiction: Ashbrook, Meadowcross, River Backwater, and Old Bridge. The last 2 hadn't paid their taxes, so Dan went to find out why. River Backwater turned out to be half empty. 10 farmsteads, of which only 6 were still inhabited. People were leaving because the river had eroded 2 fields, leaving nowhere to sow crops. The village headman, a sullen old man named Fergal, greeted Dan in silence and looked at him as if expecting the Lord to start demanding money they didn't have. Dan didn't. He asked what the village needed. Fergal was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Stones. If we reinforce the bank with stones, the river will stop eating away at the fields. But the stones have to be hauled down from the hills, and there are few people left, and they're all old." Dan asked how many people were needed. Fergal said 10 strong men for 3 days. Dan said he would find the men. He went to Ashbrook, to Graham. He asked if Ashbrook could send 5 men for 3 days to help Riverbend with the bank. In return, once Riverbend was back on its feet, it would help Ashbrook with the roof repairs that needed to be done before winter. Graham thought it over. It wasn't an order. It was a deal. A fair one. A straightforward one. He said yes. 5 men, 3 days. They reinforced the riverbank in 4 days. Fergal watched as people from the neighboring village hauled stones for his fields and couldn't find the words. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had helped Riverbend. Dan stood nearby, hauling stones too. His body was weak, but the stones weren't heavy, and his stubbornness was Bostonian. By evening on the last day, Fergal approached him. He said one sentence. "What does the Lord want from Riverbend?" Dan replied, "One thing, boil water." Fergal nodded. The 4th village, Old Bridge, was a different problem. It stood on a trade route and had once been prosperous. But 3 years ago, Count Valrod's detachment had passed through it, collecting debts from the Ashford estate. They collected from the villages. Those who couldn't pay with money paid with grain. Those who couldn't pay with grain paid with livestock. Old Bridge paid them all. The village was reduced to poverty in a single week. The people didn't leave, but they stopped considering themselves part of the House of Ashford. They believed the Ashfords had abandoned them. Dan arrived in Old Bridge and encountered hatred for the first time. Not the loud kind. Quiet. Cold. The village elder, Bran, didn't bow. He didn't invite him inside. He stood on the porch and looked down on him. He said the village needed nothing from the Lord. The village could manage on its own. They had nothing to pay with. If the Lord had come for taxes, let him take their last goat. Dan didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't make any promises. He said one thing, that he hadn't come for taxes. That the tax on Old Bridge Village had been lifted for a year. That if the village needed anything, it could send someone to the manor. And he left. Catelyn walked beside him and said nothing. Then she said quietly, "He lifted the tax." "On a village that hates him," Dan replied. "They don't hate him. They hate what was done to them in his name. Those are 2 different things, and the first step toward changing that is to stop being the source of their pain, even if they don't appreciate it." Catelyn was silent all the way home. Then she said, "He does what's right even when it doesn't work." Dan replied, "Sometimes that's the only thing you can do." Toward the end of the 2nd month, a stranger arrived at Ashford Manor. Bertha was the first to see her. The woman was standing at the gate in a dusty traveling cloak, with a sack of herbs on her back and a bruise on her cheekbone. She was short, slender, with black hair pulled back into a bun at the nape of her neck, and a face that looked as if the world owed her an explanation, and she had come to get it. Bertha called for Dan. Dan went out to the gate. The woman looked at him. He looked at her. She spoke first. She said her name was Hannah So, that she was a former novice at the Temple of the Silent Mother, that she had left the temple 3 weeks ago, that people from the temple were after her because she knew things the temple would rather bury, that she'd heard in the last town that Lord Ashford was looking for people who knew about herbs and healing, that she knew herbs and healing better than any village healer, and if the Lord gave her a place to stay, she'd offer him her services. She said all this in one breath, in a language that was almost universal, but with an accent from the Eastern Islands. Then she fell silent and looked at Dan as if she were waiting for him to refuse. Dan looked at the bruise, at the sack, at her hands, the hands of a herbalist, calluses in certain places, stains from plant dyes on her fingers, nails trimmed short. He asked one thing. Had she eaten today? Hannah blinked. Then she said no. Dan said, "Food first, then we'll talk." He led her to the kitchen. Bertha set a bowl of porridge and broth in front of her. Hannah ate quickly and greedily without hesitation. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Good broth." "Bone marrow. The onions are golden. Who cooked it?" Bertha beamed and said it was her, according to the Lord's recipe. Hannah looked at Dan with a new expression. "A Lord who knows how to make broth." Dan said, "He knows a lot of things that lords don't usually know." Hannah said, "So does she." They talked until nightfall. Dan told her about boiling water, about purity, about the creatures in the water that cause disease. Hannah listened, at first skeptically, then with growing interest, then with that hunger for knowledge that people have who've spent years in an environment where knowledge is suppressed. She replied, about herbs, about which ones heal and which ones harm, about how the abbess of the temple used her knowledge of herbs not for healing, but for control. How novices who knew too much were sent to distant convents. How, when a woman in labor came to the temple for help, the abbess ordered that she not be treated because the woman's husband owed the temple money. Hannah said that was the moment she decided to leave. She didn't say what she did before leaving, but Dan could see in her eyes that she had done something for which the temple wants to find her. He didn't ask. Instead, he asked if she could heal. Hannah replied, "Not heal, but help, yes. She knows 100 herbs and their properties. She knows how to treat a wound so it doesn't fester. She knows how to bring down a fever, how to ease childbirth, how to soothe pain. But she's not a healer. She's an herbalist," Dan said. He didn't need a healer. He needed someone who knew herbs and was willing to learn what he could teach her about cleanliness and hygiene. "Does Hannah need a job?" Hannah said. "She needs a roof over her head." Work would be payment for a roof over her head. Dan shook his head. A roof isn't payment. A roof is a roof. Everyone who lives in the Ashford house has a roof over their head. Work is work. In exchange for the work, she'll get food and lodging, and once the house is up and running, she'll get paid. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she said a phrase in the language of the Eastern Islands that Dan understood because, in another life, it had been his own language. She said, "Strange man." Dan replied in the same language, "Thank you." Hannah froze. She looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. Then her face did something Dan hadn't expected. It softened, for a single second. Then it hardened again. But that second was there. She said, "How does he know the Choson language?" Dan said, "It's a long story. He'd tell her later." Hannah nodded. She didn't press him. That was the first thing he liked about her. She knew how not to press. Hannah was put up in a room next to the kitchen, a former storage room that Olaf had cleaned out in an hour. Small, cozy, with a window facing east. Hannah looked around the room. She set down her bag. She hung bundles of herbs on the wall. 10 minutes later, the room smelled of sage and mint and something bitter that Dan didn't recognize. She went out for dinner. Everyone was sitting at the table. Bertha, Oswald, Olaf, Leanne, Caitlin, Isolde, Dan, and now Hannah. 8 people. A month ago, there had been 4. Hannah sat down next to Leanne. She looked at her with a professional gaze. Leanne sensed the gaze and turned. They looked at each other. Hannah asked, "How long have you been sick?" Leanne replied, "Since childhood." Hannah held out her hand. Leanne offered hers. Hannah looked at her nails, at her gums, at the skin on the inside of her wrist. Then she let go. She said, "It's not blood depletion. It's blood weakness. There's a difference. Depletion means the blood is running out. Weakness means the blood isn't carrying enough life. You need iron, not from food, from herbs. She knows which ones. Leanne looked at Dan. Dan nodded. Hana knew what he knew, but in different words and with different tools. Anemia, iron deficiency. In the 21st century, he would have been prescribed pills. Here, there were herbs. Hana said she'd start tomorrow. Leanne nodded. Something had changed at the table that evening. Leanne, who a month ago hadn't been able to make it to the kitchen, was sitting next to the herbalist, discussing her treatment. Not as a patient, as a participant. Caitlin was jotting down something in a notebook and occasionally looked up with an expression that Dan had learned to read. She was counting the people at the table. Every time the number grew, something inside her grew calmer. More people meant less chance that everything would fall apart. For a girl who was used to everything around her falling apart, this was medicine. Isolde sat on the edge of the table, without her left glove. Her right one was still on. She didn't join in the conversation, but she was listening. And when Hana said something sharp about the temple healers who healed with prayer rather than action, the corner of Isolde's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. The first one in a long time. Dan saw it. He remembered it. He didn't say anything. After dinner, Hana went out into the courtyard. Dan found her sitting on the porch, looking out at the south garden. The apple trees had already borne their first fruit. Small, green, but fruit nonetheless. It was early fall. Hana asked without turning around, "Is this the kinship?" Dan said yes. Hana was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. She had seen many houses. In none of them had the threads of the kinship glowed. Nowhere. In all 27 years. She'd been told that the kinship was a formality, an empty ritual. And here, apple trees in October. Dan sat down beside her. He said he didn't fully understand how it worked either, but he'd noticed one thing. The earth responds when the people in a house start caring for one another, not just for show, not out of obligation, for real. Hana turned to face him. She looked him in the eyes. She said, "You're not a lord." Dan was silent. Hana continued, "Lords don't make broth. Lords don't clean wells. Lords don't teach damned wives how to breathe." She didn't know who he was, but he wasn't a lord. Dan said, "She's right. He's not a lord. He's a therapist." Hana didn't know the word. Dan explained, "A person whose job is to help other people figure themselves out and move on with their lives." Hana thought for a moment. Then she said, "In Chosan, they call people like that something else. They're called those who sit beside you." Dan thought that was the best description of his profession he'd ever heard. They sat on the porch in silence. Above the estate, 3 strands of kinship glowed in the darkening sky. Hana wasn't a wife. She wasn't part of the union. But she was the first person in this world with whom Dan could speak without an interpreter. Not because they spoke the same language, but because they both knew what it meant to sit beside someone who was suffering and not walk away. The 3rd month began with a scandal. For the first time, Isolde had dinner at the communal table without a veil, without her left glove, and without the right one. She'd taken off the right glove herself, that morning, in her room. Then she stepped out into the hallway. She walked past Olaf, who was carrying firewood. Olaf looked at her bare hands and dropped a log on his own foot. He cursed. Isolde walked past without turning around. Bertha saw her in the kitchen and backed up against the wall. Isolde poured herself some water. Bertha watched her hands as if she expected the pitcher to melt at her touch. The pitcher didn't melt. Isolde sat down at the table. She drank the water. Her hands were pale and slender and completely ordinary. Dan walked in and saw her. He didn't say anything. He sat down across from her. He began to eat breakfast. Isolde looked at him, and something resembling gratitude flashed in her eyes, for the fact that he hadn't paid any attention, for the fact that he hadn't made a big deal out of it. Because for her, it was a big deal. A huge one. But she didn't want others to see just how much. Breakfast went by. No one died from the cursed wife's touch. Bertha relaxed halfway through her porridge. Olaf forgot about the log. Caitlin placed her bread next to Isolde's, and their fingers accidentally touched. Caitlin pulled her hand away out of habit. Isolde didn't flinch. A month ago, a casual touch would have made her leave the room. Now she pushed the bread closer to Caitlin and continued eating. A brief moment. But Dan saw how the thread of kinship with Isolde pulsed steadily and confidently. Not as vividly as with Leanne, not as gently as with Caitlin, firmly, reliable, like a lock that had finally turned. After breakfast, Isolde called Dan into her study. She had found another letter, an old one, hidden in a false bottom in a desk drawer. She discovered the false bottom by accident while measuring the drawer for new folders and noticed that the inner depth didn't match the outer one. The letter wasn't written in the handwriting of Dan's father or grandfather. It was a different handwriting, a woman's, neat and refined. Addressed to Dan Ashford's grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, née Siren. The contents: a warning. Someone from the Siren household had written to Eleanor that the college was beginning to change the rules of the marriage union, that the old texts were being removed from libraries, that families who asked questions about true kinship were being investigated and fined. The author asked Eleanor to hide the family records and not draw attention to herself. The letter was dated 40 years earlier. Dan read it. He reread it. He looked at Isolde. She said, "Someone 40 years ago already knew that the college was altering the ritual, and someone in the Ashford household knew the truth about true kinship. Dan's grandmother hid this letter because it was dangerous to keep it." Dan asked, "What does this mean for us now?" Isolde said, "It means there are other records, somewhere in the house or nearby. Grandma couldn't bring herself to destroy the family documents. She hid them. We need to find them. And it means that the college has been actively erasing knowledge of how the true union works, and Dan has somehow reawakened it. When the collegium finds out, they'll come, not to check, to erase it." Dan felt the same chill as last time, but now something else was mixed in with the chill. Anger, quiet, professional. The anger of a therapist who discovers that the support system was deliberately broken to control the very people it was meant to help. He said, "We'll find the records, and we'll prepare for the collegium's arrival." Isolde nodded. Then she said, "There's one more thing. Her gift. It's not just reading intentions. She's starting to sense lies not only through touch, from a distance, faintly, but it's growing. Grounding techniques don't suppress the gift. They unleash it. Before, it was all just noise. Now the noise is turning into a signal. She can tell the difference between lies and the truth in a conversation if the person is standing close enough." Dan asked, "How close?" Isolde said, "The length of this table." Dan looked at the table, 3 meters. A month ago, she couldn't even sit in the same room with Olaf. Now she could detect lies from a distance of 3 meters. Her thread of kinship pulsed. The gift was awakening. Not a curse, a gift. He asked if she could control when to listen and when not to. Isolde said she was learning. It doesn't always work, but she's learning. Dan said they would keep practicing, every morning. And he wanted to ask her for one thing. When Marcus arrived, and he would arrive, Dan wanted Isolde to be there, and to listen. Isolde looked at him. Something new flashed in her eyes. Not gratitude, not surprise. Recognition. He saw her gift not as a curse and not as a tool. He saw it as part of who she was, and he asked her to use it not for him, but for home. The difference was important. She said she would be there. A week passed. Hannah and Leanne worked together every day. Hannah prepared decoctions from iron-rich herbs. Leanne drank them and recorded the results. By herself. She started a notebook, a treatment notebook. Every day. What she drank, how much she slept, how she felt. Did she have shortness of breath? Did she have a cough? The color of her gums, the color of her nails. Dan didn't ask her to keep records. She started on her own. Because she realized that her body wasn't a sentence, but a system that could be observed and changed. Hannah looked at the notebook with respect. She said that not a single doctor she knew kept such records. Leanne said quietly, "She's not a doctor." Hannah replied, "Not yet." By the end of the 3rd month, Leanne could walk from the estate to the village without stopping. She still got tired by evening. She still coughed sometimes, but the blush on her cheeks was real, not from a fever. Lively. Dan saw how people in the village looked at her. A month ago, Graham had seen a thin girl who'd been brought there to die. Now he saw a young woman who had saved his wife and child and who came every week to check on them. Graham didn't just bow to her. He did better than that. He pulled up a chair for her by the hearth and poured milk for her. For the village elder, this was a sign of recognition as an equal. Meanwhile, Caitlin had paid off her second small debt. Apples from the south garden were selling steadily. The price rose as winter approached. Caitlin negotiated with the merchants in Crosstone with a precision that intimidated the grown men behind the counter. She didn't haggle loudly. She haggled with numbers. She opened her ledger. She showed the entries. Here's last week's price. Here's today's price. Here's the quantity she could supply. Here are the terms. The merchants looked at the 19-year-old girl with her ledger and sensed that something unusual. Respect. One evening, Caitlin returned from Crosstone and wasn't smiling. Dan noticed. He asked what had happened. Caitlin was silent for a long time. Then she said, "The merchant Milan at the market had told her she was a good saleswoman for a girl who's down on her luck, that it was surprising the Ashfords hadn't gone bankrupt yet with her around, that he only did business with her because the apples were good, not because he believed in her luck." She said this in an even voice, with a smile, but her hands under the table were clenched into fists. Dan waited. Caitlin continued. She wanted to respond. She wanted to say that she wasn't unlucky, that not a single shipment had fallen through in 2 months, that every coin in the ledger was earned through her own calculations. But she didn't say it, because she was used to her words changing nothing, because arguing meant drawing attention, and attention meant trouble. Dan asked what she was feeling right now. Caitlin looked up. Her smile faltered. She said, "Anger." Then she added quickly, "But that's silly." The dealer is right. She's unlucky. Everyone knows it. Dan shook his head. He said, "No, anger isn't silly. Anger means she knows her worth. She knows she deserves respect, and that someone didn't give her that respect. Anger is a healthy reaction. You don't need to hide it. You need to listen to it." Caitlin looked at him. Her smile faded. Her face became open, young, tired. She said, "She gets angry often, every day, but she's learned to keep quiet because when she spoke about how she felt, bad things happened. To her, to others. She's gotten used to thinking that her feelings are dangerous." Dan said, "Her feelings aren't dangerous. Her feelings are who she is, and she isn't dangerous. She's the person who keeps impeccable records and signs contracts and feeds a whole house with apples from the garden that had blossomed because the people in this house had started to care for one another." Caitlin pressed her lips together. Her eyes reddened. She didn't cry, but she was close to it. She said quietly, "Thank you." She stood up. She left. The thread of kinship with Caitlin pulsed softly and steadily. In the 6th month, Caitlin broke down. Not suddenly, not because of one thing, because of everything at once. Dan found her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. She was sitting on the floor between a barrel of flour and the wall, knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her head. Her body was shaking. She wasn't crying. She was shivering, small, rapid shivers like someone shivering from the cold, but the kitchen was warm. Dan sat down next to her, not across from her, but right beside her, with his back to the wall, at arm's length, without touching her. Caitlin spoke, not right away, but after 5 minutes of silence. She said, "Because of her, something's going to happen again." The voice wasn't hers, not the voice that haggled with merchants, kept the books, and smiled. It was the voice of a girl who had walked down the aisle 4 times and walked away alone 4 times. Dan asked quietly, "What happened?" Caitlin spoke in fits and starts, between shivers. That afternoon at the market in Crosstone, a merchant's cart overturned right next to her. It just tipped over. A wheel flew off. Sacks of grain spilled onto the road. The merchant wasn't hurt, but the people around her saw who was standing nearby, and she saw their faces. That familiar look. Bad luck. She brings misfortune. She's a walking curse. Then that evening, Olaf cut his hand in the workshop. Deeply. Hannah bandaged it. No big deal. But Caitlin saw the blood and thought, it's me. Then at dinner, Bertha dropped a pot. She just dropped it. Her hands were slippery. It happens. But Caitlin sat at the table and counted. The cart, the cut, the pot. 3 things in one day. She knew that count. She'd been keeping it her whole life. 1 bad incident is a coincidence. 2 is a pattern. 3 is her. She said all this while sitting on the kitchen floor, and every word was like a stone she'd been carrying for years and had finally dropped. She said she needed to leave, that she would break this house just as she'd broken everything else, that Dan and Leanne and Isolde and Hannah and everyone else would be better off without her, that every day she was here, she brought them trouble, and that she was scared. For the first time in 6 months, she said she was scared. Not everything is fine. She's scared. Dan sat beside her. He didn't comfort her. He didn't argue. He didn't say she was wrong. He didn't say everything would be okay. He knew those words were useless right now. Worse than useless. They devalue what she's feeling. And what she's feeling is 20 years of conviction that she's poison to everyone around her. That can't be cured with a single conversation. He said one thing. I'm staying. Caitlin looked up. She looked at him. He repeated it. I'm staying. She could speak. She could stay silent. She could cry. She could get up and leave. He would stay here, on the floor, right beside her, for as long as it takes. Caitlin looked at him. Then she turned away, and she cried, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. She didn't hide them. For the first time in years, she cried in front of, and that person didn't walk away or tell her she was overreacting. Dan sat there. 20 minutes, 40, an hour and a half. For 2 hours, he sat on the kitchen floor next to a 19-year-old girl who was crying out all the tears she'd been holding back since she was 13, when her first fiancé died and everyone said it was her. After 2 hours, she stopped crying. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at him with red eyes, and she said, "He'll really stay." Dan said, "He'll really stay." Caitlin nodded. She closed her eyes. She leaned against the wall, and at that moment, the thread of kinship above her flared up. Not quietly, not evenly. It blazed powerfully and brightly, third in strength only to Leanne's thread and Isolde's thread, but different. If Leanne's thread was warm and Isolde's thread was rigid, then Caitlin's thread was broad, like a shield, like a wall, like a dome. Dan saw the light and didn't understand what was happening, but he sensed it. Something in the air had changed, as if an invisible pressure that had hung over the estate from day one had suddenly eased, as if someone had lifted a heavy blanket off the roof. In the morning, Oswald came to breakfast with news. The first piece. Olaf had inspected the road to Crosstone. The pothole that had been there for 3 years and had been breaking wheels had disappeared. It had simply vanished. The ground had leveled out. Second, Bertha had found the cat she hadn't seen for 2 weeks. He'd come back on his own, healthy, with a mouse. Third, Oswald woke up in the morning and didn't want to drink, for the first time in 5 years. He didn't know what to do about it, so he drank anyway. But the fact remained. Little things, coincidences, or maybe not. Caitlin's gift was awakening, not as a curse, as a shield. All her life she had unconsciously taken on the misfortunes of those around her, like a funnel. Every misfortune of every person around her became her own misfortune. The wagon broke down not because Caitlin was unlucky, But because Caitlin unconsciously drew toward herself the small disasters that were meant to happen to others, she protected the people around her at the cost of her own life. And she didn't know it. Now she knew, not completely, but it was a start. Dan explained it to her that morning over breakfast, gently, not as a diagnosis, as a hypothesis. He said he thought her bad luck wasn't a curse, but a gift turned upside down. That she wasn't breaking the world around her. She was taking the blows meant for others, unconsciously, without control. Like a person who throws themselves in front of a car to save a child, but does it every day without understanding why they keep getting hit by cars. Caitlin listened. Her eyes were red from the night before. There was no smile, and that was good. She listened without a mask. Dan continued. Last night, when she allowed herself to feel, something changed. The shield stopped pulling everything onto itself and began to function differently. Not like a funnel, but like a dome. Not drawing misfortune in, but deflecting it. Caitlin asked quietly, "Can she control it?" Dan answered honestly. He didn't know. He thought so. But this was his territory no more than it was hers. They would figure it out together. Caitlin nodded. Then she did something Dan hadn't expected. She reached across the table and touched his palm, briefly, for a second, and she said, "Thank you for staying." Dan said, "Always." Dan went out into the yard after breakfast. 3 threads of kinship glowed in the morning sky, bright, alive, different. The golden one toward Leanne, a silver one to Isolde, a broad copper one to Caitlin. He stood there watching and thinking about how, 6 months ago, he had died on a highway in Massachusetts. And now he was standing in the courtyard of a medieval manor, and the 3 women whom the whole world had considered defective turned out to be the strongest people he had ever met. Ashford Manor had stopped to crumble. It had begun to grow. And somewhere far to the south, on the trade route to the old bridge, a band of robbers who had been raiding wagons every week turned their horses in the other direction. For no reason. They simply didn't want to take that road. The band's captain later said that he'd felt uneasy, as if the road didn't want anyone with evil intentions to travel on it. He didn't know that a 19-year-old girl at the estate beyond the hill had fallen asleep without fear for the first time in 6 months, and her gift was working properly for the first time. The 9th month began with a visit. Marcus Ashford arrived in person. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 2 men. A notary from the marriage board named Stetton, a thin man with perpetually wet lips and a habit of jotting down every word in a small notebook. And a witness, a merchant from Crosstone named Milan, the very same Milan who had called Caitlin unlucky. Dan met them in the courtyard, unarmed, in a clean shirt. Isolde stood beside him, without a veil, without gloves. Her face was calm, and her eyes looked at the guests as if reading them like an open book, because they were. Marcus had changed since Dan had last seen him at the wedding. Back then he'd been smirking, not now. Now he looked like a man who'd come to a funeral and was planning to enjoy it, but was holding back for the sake of propriety. He bowed just enough to be polite. He said he'd come at an invitation, that he wanted to make sure his cousin was doing all right, that the notary was there as a formality, that the witness was there because that's how it's supposed to be. Everything was polite. Everything went smoothly. Everything had an ulterior motive. Isolde stood next to Dan, and he saw her tilt her head slightly. She was listening, not to the words, but to what lay behind them. Dan invited the guests into the house. The kitchen was clean. The table was set. Bertha had prepared the best she could with the ingredients available. Soup, fresh bread, apples from the south garden, butter that Caitlin had bargained for at a good price last week. Marcus walked into the kitchen and stopped. 9 months ago, this kitchen had been dirty and lifeless. Now it was alive. Bertha stood at the stove with the dignity of a cook who knows her broth is the best in the neighborhood. Olaf sat in the corner, mending a shutter hinge. Caitlin sat at the table with the ledger. Leanne was in the village with Hannah. Marcus watched. His face twitched slightly. He had expected ruins. He had come to finish off the ruins. but he had found a home. They sat down at the table. Dan offered tea. Marcus declined. Stetton took out the ledger. Marcus began, formally, point by point. The confirmation ceremony, vassal oaths, the inspection of the lands, the presentation of the wives to the court. Each point was a brick in the wall of the claim. Dan responded, calmly, point by point. The confirmation ceremony was held on the wedding day. The priest can confirm this. Vassal oaths were not sworn because the House Ashford House had no vassals at the time of inheritance. One cannot accept an oath that no one is there to take. The inspection of the lands was conducted in person. Dan visited all 4 villages within the first month. There are witnesses. The presentation of the wives to the court has been postponed due to Lady Leanne's health. The law allows for a deferral of up to 1 year. Every answer was backed up by an entry from Caitlin's book. Caitlin turned to the right page without a hitch. Dates, names, witness signatures. Stetton took notes. His wet lips tightened more and more with each point. He had come for evidence of incapacity. He was presented with impeccable accounting records. Marcus changed his tactics. He shifted from formalities to provocation. He asked how the damned wife was doing. He didn't mention her by name. That damned woman. Isolde was sitting next to Dan. Her expression hadn't changed. But Dan saw her fingers clench slightly on the table. Dan replied calmly, "Lady Isolde is well. She thanks you for your concern." Marcus smiled. He asked, "And that unlucky one? They say she's haggling at the market like a commoner. Is that fitting for Lord Ashford's wife?" Caitlin looked up from her book. There was no smile. Dan said, "Lady Caitlin manages the Ashford household's finances. If Cousin Marcus wishes to discuss what is proper, he might start with the debts left by the previous lord. Lady Caitlin has paid off 2 out of 3 in 9 months." Marcus paled slightly. Stetton stopped writing. The merchant Milan sat in the corner and remained. He was there as a witness to Caitlin's misfortune. Marcus had brought him along so he could confirm that the lord's wife brought bad luck. But over the past few months, Milan had seen something else. He had seen a young woman who delivered apples without a single misstep, who paid on time, who ran the business better than half the merchants in the market. Marcus asked Milan to confirm that Caitlin O'Brien brought misfortune. Milan opened his mouth. Isolde turned her head slightly toward him. Milan looked at her, then at Caitlin. Then he spoke. He couldn't confirm it. Lady Caitlin was the best business partner he'd had in the past year. Marcus flushed. Stetton made a note in his notebook. The visit lasted 2 hours. Marcus tried to find a crack. There was no crack. Every question had an answer. Every accusation was backed by a document. Every provocation was shattered by Dan's composure, Isolde's silence, and Caitlin's figures. As Marcus was leaving, he paused at the threshold. He turned to Dan. He spoke quietly so the notary wouldn't hear. "He doesn't know what Dan is doing. But this won't last. The big families don't tolerate what they don't understand." Dan replied just as quietly, "He knows." Marcus left. Isolde approached Dan once the guests had disappeared over the hill. She said, "Marcus won't back down. He'll file a lawsuit. But not in his own name. He'll go to Valrod." She could sense it in him, not the words. Intent. He's afraid to act on his own. But he'll go to someone who isn't afraid. Dan nodded. They had 3 months left until the Valrod's debt was due, and now Valrod would receive a detailed report from Marcus, stating that the Ashford estate was not dying, but thriving. For Count Valrod, this was not good news. A living debtor is more dangerous than a dead one. A dead one can be written off. Winter arrived in the 11th month and brought with it 2 events. First, Caitlin paid off the 3rd small debt, and for the first time in the Ashford house's history over the past 10 years, the cash register showed a positive balance. Small, fragile, but positive. Caitlin brought the ledger to Dan and showed him the final line. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't dart about. She didn't offer a polite smile. She looked at the numbers with the quiet pride of someone who had built something with their own hands and knew it was solid. Dan said, "Caitlin, you saved this house." She didn't look away. She didn't cry. She didn't say thank you. She said, "We saved it." The thread of kinship with her burned steadily and brightly. The second event was worse. Count Huldrych Valrod sent a messenger. Not a letter, a messenger. A man in the Valrod household livery, riding a horse that was worth more than all the Ashfords' property combined. The messenger delivered a verbal message. The Count invites Lord Ashford to a winter reception at Valrod Castle. In 2 weeks, attendance was mandatory. It was casually mentioned that the debt for the southern lands was due in 3 months, and that the Count would like to discuss the terms. This was no invitation. It was a summons. Dan called a council meeting. Everyone was at the table, 9 people. Bertha, Oswald, Olaf, Leanne, Isolde, Caitlin, Hannah, and 2 newcomers. Over the past month, more people had arrived at the house. A boy from Ashbrook named Tim, 17 years old, an orphan. Graham had sent him to help out on the estate. Tim turned out to be quick and sharp, and Oswald began teaching him the ropes of being a steward. And an old seamstress from River Ford named Meg, who had come on her own because she'd heard that at the Ashford house they fed people and didn't beat them. She mended clothes and taught Bertha to embroider, and grumbled at everyone equally. Dan explained the situation. "Valrod is summoning us. We can't refuse to go. A refusal would be taken as an insult and a reason for immediate debt collection. Going means playing on someone else's turf by their rules." Isolde said, "She must go with him. She'll find out what Valrod is hiding." Caitlin said, "I'll go too with the books. If the debt comes up, I have the figures showing the repayment schedule and a plan for full repayment within a year." Leanne said quietly, "I'll go too." Everyone looked at her. Leanne wasn't a merchant. She wasn't a strategist. She wasn't a diplomat. But she said, "Valrod needs to see that the wife they sent here to die is still standing on her own 2 feet. That argument is stronger than any numbers. Dan looked at his 3 wives. 9 months ago, one of them couldn't even make it to the kitchen. The second wouldn't leave her room. The third hid behind a smile. Now they were sitting at the table, planning how to greet the Count. Hannah said she was staying at the estate. Someone had to look after the house and the sick in the villages. Olaf said he would go with the Lord, just in case strong hands were needed. He didn't specify what for. Everyone understood. They set out a week later in 2 wagons. One was lent by Graham, the other by Fergal from Riverbend. Bran from Old Bridge provided the horse. The very same Bran who, a year ago, had refused to bow and said the village needed nothing from the Lord. He came in the morning before their departure. He brought the horse, a sturdy black gelding. He spoke briefly. "The horse is on credit. Return it when you return." And he left. Dan watched him go and thought about how the lifted tax and a year of peace had accomplished more than any promises ever could. Valrod Castle stood on a hill 3 days' journey away. Large, stone, with towers that told the world one simple thing: we've been here a long time, and we're stronger than you. They arrived in the evening. The winter reception had already begun. The courtyard was full of guests, lords of small and medium-sized houses, their wives and their heirs, servants, musicians. Count Valrod's court was wealthy, and he wanted everyone to see it. Dan entered the hall and felt 30 pairs of eyes on him. Ashford, that upstart Ashford with his 3 failed marriages. He heard the whispers. He saw the smiles. A familiar feeling, like a new social worker at a veterans conference in Boston. Everyone's waiting for you to slip up. Isolde walked beside him. Upright, calm, her eyes scanned the room. She read the room like an open book. To his left walked Caitlin, no smile, a book under her arm. To his right walked Leanne, more than the others, but on her own, without help, with a blush on her cheeks that had seemed impossible 9 months ago. Count Huldrych Valrod met them at the head table, a large man with a stern face and eyes that counted people like coins. He looked at Dan, then at his 3 wives. He lingered on Leanne. He raised an eyebrow slightly. He remembered. He knew this girl had been sent here to die, and yet she was standing there, breathing, looking him in the eye. Valrod said, "I'm glad to see the Ashford household in good health." He hoped to discuss business over dinner. Dan bowed precisely, not a degree less. Dinner lasted 3 hours. Dan sat next to Valrod and talked about the weather, about trade, about grain prices. Valrod was probing. He asked questions that seemed innocent, but each one had a catch. Like the harvest in the southern lands. How are the wives' health? Is it true that apple trees bloom in winter? Dan answered calmly. Every answer was precise. Every answer was incomplete. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't giving Valrod what he wanted. Control. Isolde sat 2 seats away and listened. After dinner, when they returned to their private room, she said, "Valrod doesn't want money. He wants land, the Ashford's southern lands. He knows they stay green out of season, and he wants them. Debt is leverage. If Dan pays, Valrod will find another lever. Money won't solve the problem." Dan nodded. He'd suspected as much. Caitlin added, "I've done the math. Even if we sell all the apples by the end of winter at the highest price, it will only cover 2/3 of the debt. We need another plan." Leanne remained silent. Then she spoke. At the reception, she'd spoken with Baron Craigan's wife, a small house west of Valrod. "Craigan's wife is ill. She's been sick for a long time. The doctors can't help her." Leanne had seen the symptoms, a certain kind of pallor, frequent blinking, swelling in her hands. Leanne thinks it's not an illness, it's poisoning. Lead. From the white powder Lady Craigan applies to her face every morning. Cosmetics in this world contained lead. Dan knew that. Now Leanne knew it too. If she was right, and if they helped Lady Craigan, Baron Craigan would owe them a debt, not money, gratitude. And in the world of Underline, a young lord's gratitude meant a vote on the council, an ally. Dan looked at his wives. 9 months ago, he had been making broth in someone else's kitchen. Now 3 women sat before him, each offering a solution, strategic, financial, medical. He said, "We'll do all 3. Tomorrow he would speak with Valrod about debt restructuring. Caitlin would present the figures. Leanne would visit Lady Craigan. Isolde would listen. They nodded. 3 women, 3 approaches, 1 goal. House Ashford would survive. Valrod invited Dan to the winter reception. All 3 wives went with him. Isolde determined that Valrod wanted the southern lands, not money. Caitlin calculated that there wouldn't be enough money for full repayment. Leanne discovered that Baron Craigan's wife had been poisoned with lead white and offered to help her in exchange for a political alliance. The next day at Valrod Castle was the longest day of Dan Ashford's life. The morning began with negotiations. Dan sat across from Count Huldrych Valrod in his study. The study was as large as the entire lower floor of the Ashford estate. Tapestries hung on the walls. Silver inkwells stood on the table. Everything screamed money. Valrod brought up the debt. Directly, without beating around the bush. Due in 3 months. The full amount. Interest had accrued over 2 years. The terms of the contract were clear. If the debt wasn't paid, the southern lands would pass to the House of Valrod. Dan listened. Then he took out the document that Caitlin had prepared that night. A repayment plan. Not full payment by the due date. Restructuring. Half the amount by the due date, the other half over the course of a year. With interest. With a guarantee to supply apples from the southern orchard at a fixed price. Dan explained the figures. Calmly. Just like at a meeting with the guardianship committee in Boston, when you need to convince an official that the family will manage if given another 6 months. Valrod listened. His expression didn't change. When Dan finished, the Earl was silent for a moment. Then he said, "It's an interesting proposal, but the terms of the contract do not provide for restructuring." Dan said that the contract had been signed by the previous Lord Ashford, in a state that any notary would deem improper. His father was drunk when he signed it. That doesn't cancel the debt, but it creates grounds for renegotiating the terms. Valrod narrowed his eyes slightly. It was a blow he hadn't expected. Not because the argument was strong, it was debatable, but because a boy from a ruined household was sitting before him, haggling. Not begging, haggling. Valrod said he would think it over. Dan bowed and left. Isolde was waiting for him in the hallway. She was standing by the window, looking out into the courtyard. When he approached, she said without turning around, "Valrod won't accept the plan. He's already decided to take the land. The negotiations are just a formality for him." Dan asked, "Is she sure?" Isolde turned around. In her eyes was the calmness of someone who sees the truth and has long since stopped being surprised that the truth is ugly. She said, "I'm sure. When you were talking about restructuring, he was already thinking about how he would use the southern lands. His intentions were right there on top of your words, like a second voice. He was listening to you while simultaneously figuring out what kind of house to build on the southern hill." Dan closed his eyes. Then he opened them. "All right. So we need a different approach." Meanwhile, Leanne was with Lady Craigan. Baron Craigan initially didn't want to let Lord Ashford's wife see his own wife. Why? What could a girl from a poor family possibly know? But Leanne told him quietly and confidently that she saw something in his wife that the doctors couldn't see, and that she could help if he'd let her. Craigan looked at her. 9 months ago, she would have lowered her eyes and walked away. Now she stood there and waited. He let her in. Leanne spent 2 hours with Lady Craigan. She examined her, asked her questions, quietly, patiently. Dan's questions, Dan's technique, but Leanne's voice and hands. She found the white powder. Lady Craigan showed her the little box. A white powder with a scent that Leanne had already learned to fear. Lead. Every morning on her face. Every morning, a small dose of poison into her skin. For years. Leanne explained, simply, without blame, without panic. White powder makes the skin white, but what's in it poisons the blood. Slowly, imperceptibly. The symptoms Lady Craigan mistakes for an illness are actually poisoning. If she stops using the white powder, her body will begin to cleanse itself. Leanne gave her a recipe for a herbal decoction to cleanse her system. Hannah's recipe, tried and true, safe. Lady Craigan wept, not out of grief, out of relief. For years she'd been told she was dying, but it turned out she'd simply been using the wrong makeup. Baron Craigan came out to see Leanne off. His face bore the expression of a man who'd been given back what he thought was lost. He asked how he could thank her. Leanne said, "Nothing. Just throw away the white powder." Craigan watched her leave for a long time. That evening, at the second dinner, Dan sat at the table and listened as the lords around him discussed politics, Prince Cassian consolidating power, new taxes, about the college tightening its inspections. Baron Craigan was sitting nearby. He joined him on his own. He spoke quietly. He said his wife was feeling better. Already, in just 1 day. She'd thrown out the white powder. She's drinking a herbal decoction. He said that if Lord Ashford ever needed a vote in the Council of the Small Houses, Baron Craigan would remember this day. Dan thanked him. Craigan left. But by the end of the evening, 2 more men approached Dan. Baron Tenley, whose mother had suffered from similar symptoms, and Lord Finn, whose daughter hadn't slept for 3 months and whose physicians had spoken of a curse. Dan listened to each of them. He asked questions. He didn't make any diagnoses, but he did speak. "Send someone to the Ashford estate. Our Lady Leanne and the herbalist Hannah will take a look. They don't cure, they help." The 2 lords left with his words and with something in their eyes that Dan recognized. Hope. Small, cautious, but real. They left Valrod Castle 3 days later, without a decision on the debt. Valrod said he'd think about it. Isolde said he'd already thought about it and the answer would be no. But they left with something else, with 3 names. Craigan, Tenley, Finn. 3 young lords who knew the name Leanne Ashford, and who were grateful not for politics, but for the fact that, for the first time, someone had looked at their loved ones as people rather than as an entry in a register. Dan rode in the wagon, staring at the road. He was thinking. Valrod would take the southern lands in 3 months, unless they found another way. Caitlin sat beside him, counting in a book. Leanne slept in the wagon, wrapped in a blanket. She was tired. She had done more in 3 days than in her entire life before Ashford. Isolde rode ahead beside Olaf. Her back was straight. Her eyes were closed. She was taking a break from the unfamiliar voices that had been thundering in her head for 3 days. She'd held out. 3 days in a castle full of people. 3 days of non-stop reading. 3 days without a breakdown. Dan looked at her and thought that 9 months ago, she wouldn't have been able to sit in the kitchen with 5 people. They'd changed. All of them. And so had he. He was no longer a therapist from Boston trapped in a stranger's body. He was Dan Ashford, with 3 wives, with a home, with people, with a debt he didn't know how to pay, but with something that no amount of money could buy. With a family. 1 year and 2 months. The debt to Valrod was due to be settled in 4 weeks. Dan stood in his study, looking at a map of the Ashford estates, lost in thought. Caitlin had gathered everything she could. Apples, trade, savings. A third of the amount was still missing. A large third. Isolde walked in without knocking. She was holding a bundle in her hands, an old one, leather, tied with a rope that crumbled at the touch. She said, "I found it." Dan looked at the bundle. Isolde explained. She'd been searching for family records that Dan's grandmother had hidden from the Sarin house after receiving a warning. She'd been searching for 12 months. Not in the study, not in the library, not in the bath. In the basement, in the wall, behind a stone that was half a shade different from the others. She noticed it because her gift told her that something was wrong with that wall. Not a lie, a secret. The wall held a secret, and Isolde sensed it. Dan unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay 3 documents. The first, the Ashford family tree. Complete. All the way back to the first kings. The line was unbroken. The Ashfords were direct descendants of one of the first houses. Not a great one, but a minor one. But an authentic one, with a right known as the privilege of the land. This right meant that the lands of the direct descendants of the first houses could not be forfeited for debt, only through voluntary sale, with the Lord's consent. The contract with Valrod, in which the lands were transferred automatically, was invalid from the very beginning. The second document, a description of the authentic ritual of the marriage union. Not that watered-down ceremony they performed in Anderline now, the real one, the old one. The description stated what Dan already knew intuitively. Kinship grows from genuine care. The land responds to trust. The union is not between blood and blood, it is between heart and heart. And one more detail. The union is not limited to a single couple. Every person who becomes part of the household through trust rather than coercion adds their own thread. Not just wives, everyone, servants, vassals, peasants, anyone who stays of their own free will. Dan recalled a winter evening when he stepped out into the courtyard and saw thin threads stretching from the knot of kinship to the villages, the hospital, and the barracks. It wasn't his imagination, reality. The third document, a letter from one of the first kings, ancient, cracked, barely legible. Isolde deciphered it in 3 days. In the letter, the king addressed his descendants. He wrote that the union is not an instrument of power, it is a covenant with the land. The land of Anderline is alive. It grants strength to those who care for it. It takes strength away from those who take from it. Someday, there will be those who try to subvert the covenant, to turn care into control, to turn the union into a transaction. When that happens, the land will begin to die, and it will keep dying until someone remembers. Dan set the letter down. He looked at Isolde. She said, "The crown altered the ritual 100 years ago, and for 100 years the land of Underline has been dying. Harvests have failed, springs have dried up, forests have thinned, Everyone thought it was a natural process. It's not a process, it's a consequence. Dan said, "The first document resolves the issue with Valrod. The land's privilege renders the contract for the southern lands null and void," Isolde said. "If the college recognizes the document as authentic," Dan said, "the same college that rejected my grandfather's request regarding the bloodline 40 years ago, the one that altered the ritual, the one that destroyed the records. They won't recognize it," Isolde nodded. "So we need another way. Not through the college, through the people." Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He convened a council, not a family one, but the first council of allies. Baron Cragen, Lord Finn, Baron Tenley, and 3 others arrived at Ashford Manor. Lord Hammond, whose village Dan had saved from the plague 2 months earlier by teaching the villagers to boil water and quarantine the sick. Baron West, whom Caitlin had helped sort out his tangled debts and find a way to pay them off. And Lady Oren, a widow whose daughter Dan had talked out of being sent to the temple and instead taken in as a student by Hannah. 6 minor lords gathered around a single table in a manor that had been in ruins just a year ago. Dan showed them the family tree. He explained the privilege of the land. He explained that Valrod's contract was null and void, but that the college would not recognize the document. He asked one thing. If he presented the document not to the college, but to the royal court, would they support him as witnesses to its authenticity? The 6 lords exchanged glances. It was a risk. To stand against Valrod meant making an enemy. To stand against the college meant making an even more formidable enemy. Cragen spoke first. He said that his wife no longer wore white and, for the first time in 3 years, was eating with appetite. That his son was seeing his mother healthy for the first time. That he remembered who had done this, and that if Lord Ashford asked for his vote, Baron Cragen would give his vote. Finn said his daughter was asleep. West said his debts were calculated and under control for the first time in 10 years. Hammond said not a single child had died in his village since they'd started boiling their water. Lady Oren said her daughter was studying with Hannah and was smiling for the first time in a year. Tenley was silent longer than anyone else. Then he said, "He doesn't know what Ashford is doing, but he sees the results, and the results speak louder than any words." 6 voices. Dan bowed to each one, not as a lord to his vassals, but as a man to his fellow men. They didn't take an oath. They didn't swear allegiance. They simply decided to stand by his side, of their own free will. 2 weeks later, Dan filed the documents with the royal court, not with the college, to the court, with his family tree attached, with 6 witness statements, with the Ashford household's complete financial records prepared by Caitlin, with Leanne's medical records, which showed how true kinship restores health, with Isolde's conclusion regarding the falsity of the college's standard ritual, supported by an ancient text from the secret vault. Count Valrod learned of the filed lawsuit 3 days later. Marcus, who brought him the news, said that his cousin had dared to bypass the college. Valrod remained silent. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a puppy. He got a net. The news reached the capital a week later. Lord Inquisitor Alric Morn, head of the marriage college, read a copy of the petition. He set the paper aside. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he summoned his secretary and dictated an order. Send an inquisitor to the Ashford estate. Investigate the union, immediately. Spring of the 2nd year. Inquisitor Alric Morn arrived at the Ashford estate at dawn. Without a guard, alone. Wearing a plain traveling cloak without the college's insignia. Dan came out to meet him. He knew who was coming. Isolde had warned him 2 days earlier. She had sensed his intent from a day's journey away. Not hostile, not friendly. Weary. The intent of a man who does his job and long ago stopped asking why. Morn was older than Dan had expected, around 50, a narrow face, gray eyes, the hands of a man who writes a lot. He bowed, not formally, with dignity. He introduced himself. He said he had arrived on the orders of the college to verify the authenticity of the marriage union at the Ashford household, that the procedure was standard, that based on its results, a report would be compiled for His Highness the Prince Regent. Dan invited him into the house. Morn entered and paused in the kitchen doorway. People were seated at the table. Bertha was ladling out broth. Olaf was mending a buttonhole. Leanne was checking the entries in her treatment notebook. Caitlin was balancing the books. Hannah was sorting through herbs. Isolde was reading a letter. Meg was darning a shirt. Tim was sweeping. Evelyn Asher, who had arrived in Ashford a month ago as a guest of her father, the Earl of Valrod, and who, over the course of that month, had quietly and unobtrusively stopped writing reports to her father and begun helping Caitlin with the books, was sitting by the window with a cup of tea. Maeve Kerr, hired 3 months ago as captain of a 6-sword mercenary squad, was snoring on a bench against the wall after her night shift. Morn stood in the doorway and watched. He had inspected dozens of houses during his career. He had seen empty castles with golden candelabras. He had seen wealthy estates where the wives didn't know the servants' names, and the servants didn't know their mistresses' faces. He had never once seen a kitchen where a lord, his wives, the servants, a mercenary, a herbalist, and a guest from a hostile house sat at the same table, each going about their business, and no one stood up at the sight of an inquisitor. Because they hadn't noticed. No, they had noticed, but no one was afraid. Dan offered him a chair. Morn sat down. Bertha placed a bowl of broth in front of him. He looked at the broth, then at Dan. He asked, "It's part of the inspection," Dan replied. "It's breakfast." Morn was silent for a moment. Then he began to eat. The inspection lasted 3 days. Morn surveyed the estate. The south garden was in bloom, apple trees bearing fruit out of season. A vegetable garden that yielded produce year-round. He spoke with each of the wives, separately, in the study, behind a closed door. Dan wasn't present. He hadn't asked to be there. Leanne went in to see the inquisitor and came out an hour later, calm. She told Dan afterward that Morn had asked about her health, about how she'd felt before the wedding and after, about what had changed. She answered honestly. That was all. Isolde went in to see the inquisitor and came out 40 minutes later. Morn followed her out, his face paler than usual. Dan didn't ask what had happened. Isolde didn't say anything either. But that evening she said one thing. Morn isn't an enemy. He's a man who believes the old order was necessary, who sees that the order caused harm, and who doesn't know how to reconcile the first with the second. Caitlin went in to see the inquisitor with a book. She came out 2 hours later. After she left, Morn asked Dan for permission to examine the books more closely. Dan granted it. Caitlin said later that the inquisitor had leafed through the book for a long time in silence, and once he shook his head and said quietly, "Flawless." Morn spoke with Hannah, with Maeve, with Olaf, with Bertha, with Graham from Ashbrook, who had come at Dan's invitation, with Fergal from River Ford, even with Bran from Oldbridge, who had come on his own, without an invitation. He stood at the gate and waited until he was called in. Morn asked him why he was there. Bran said, "Because a year ago, the young lord waived the tax and asked for nothing in return. And then he sent a healer when Fergal's wife fell ill. And then he gave us seeds for the spring when Oldbridge had nothing to sow. And he asked for nothing in return." Morn asked, "And you came on orders?" Bran said, "No. He came because he came." Morn made a note of it. On the third evening, Dan found Morn on the porch. The inquisitor was sitting there, gazing at the sky. 3 threads of kinship intertwined above the estate in a bright knot. Thin threads stretched out from the knot toward the villages, to the hospital that Leanne and Hannah had opened 2 months ago, to Maeve's barracks, to the school, to the road where Caitlin's gift kept bandits at bay. Morn looked at the threads. He saw the kinship. He was an inquisitor. That was his job. He had seen the kinship in every house he'd inspected. Dull, extinguished, formal. Here it burned brightly. Dan sat down beside him, in silence. They sat for 5 minutes, 10. Morn spoke. He said he had served the college for 30 years. that he believed the ritual's alteration had been necessary, that the old union had made the houses too powerful, that the crown could not rule a kingdom where every house with a genuine kinship became a small state, that centralization had saved Underline from collapse. Dan listened. Morn continued. He said that he had seen what he had seen over the past 3 days, that a sick wife who was supposed to die was healing people in the village, that a cursed wife whom her family had disowned was reading lies and writing laws, that an unlucky wife whom everyone considered a walking disaster was protecting an entire estate, that the peasants were coming not because they were ordered to, that the servants don't bow because they aren't afraid, that apple trees are blooming in winter, that in 30 years he had never seen anything like it. Dan said, "He isn't trying to destroy the college. He isn't trying to overthrow the crown. He wants his home to survive. He wants his wives to be safe. He wants the people who have come to him not to be cast back into the world that cast them out," Morn said. "He knows. He sees it. That's the problem. Because if he writes the truth in the report, Prince Cassian won't leave Ashford alone. He'll come, with an army. Not because Ashford threatens the crown, but because Ashford proves that the crown was wrong. Wrong for 100 years, Dan said. And that's what will be in the report." Morn was silent. For a long time. The threads of kinship pulsed quietly in the sky. Then the Inquisitor stood up. He looked at Dan. He said he would write the truth, because for the first time in 30 years he had seen what the Union truly existed for, and because that broth was the best he'd had in the last 10 years. The shadow of a smile. The first in 3 days. Dan offered him some tea. Morn accepted. They sat on the porch and drank tea. Dan asked how long it had been since he'd slept. Morn looked at him. Then he said quietly, "A long time." Dan nodded. He said the guest room was available. A clean bed, a warm blanket, breakfast at 7. Morn stood there for a second. Then he nodded. He went into the house. In the morning, he left, with the certificate he'd signed at the desk in the study in front of witnesses. The union at the Ashford residence is valid. The kinship is genuine. No anomalies detected. The document bears the seal of the Inquisitor of the marriage college. Legally, this meant that the college could not annul the union. Practically, it meant that Cassian would receive a report stating that in a remote house on the southern border, a fire burns that is found nowhere else in the kingdom. Morn was riding toward the capital, knowing that his report would change everything, for the Ashfords, for the board, and for himself. A week after Morn's departure, the royal court ruled on the Ashfords' lawsuit. The land privilege was recognized as genuine. The contract for the southern lands was null and void. The debt remained, but the land pledged as collateral was annulled. Valrod had lost. Not the battle, the first move. The Count stood in his study, staring at the court's ruling. 6 seals of the lesser lords. The Inquisitor's signature. The family tree he had thought was lost. Marcus stood silently beside him. There was nothing to say. Valrod said, "This isn't the end." Marcus nodded. Valrod said, "Write to the prince." Marcus nodded again. The letter was sent to the capital that very day. Prince Regent Cassian Anderline read both documents in a single evening, Inquisitor Morn's report and Count Valrod's letter. He rose from his desk and walked to the window. He looked south, and for the first time in 10 years of reign, he felt his fingers grow cold. On the horizon, far away, at the very edge of his vision, a light shone. Bright, warm, alive. The emblem of the Ashford house, visible from the capital. Cassian stood by the window and understood. That light cannot be extinguished by decree. It cannot be bought. It cannot be intimidated. Because that light does not burn out of fear. It burns because, in a small house on the southern border, someone is cooking broth. Someone is keeping the books. Someone is tending to the sick. Someone is teaching children. Someone is repairing fences. Someone is seeing through lies. Someone is guarding the roads. and someone is sitting on the floor next to a crying girl and saying one word, "I'm staying." Cassian stepped away from the window. He summoned the Chancellor. He said, "Prepare the council." And from that day, the Ashford house ceased to be a home. It became a beginning. Ashmark was not born in battle, not in a manifesto, not at a coronation. It was born in a pot of broth, in a notebook full of numbers, in the first pair of gloves taken off at the table, in 2 hours of silence on the kitchen floor, in a note slipped under the door with a single word written on it: candles. He was born because a man from another world came to the place where 3 girls were waiting to be passed over once again. And he chose. On a spring morning, Dan Ashford stood in the courtyard of his estate. Leanne stood beside him, a medical bag slung over her shoulder. Alive, strong, with a quiet, dry sense of humor that had finally stopped hiding. Standing beside her was Isolde, without gloves, calm, with eyes that saw the truth and were no longer afraid of it. Standing beside her was Caitlin, with a book of laws, without a smile, with a face, a real face. Standing beside her was Hannah, with her herbs and her curses and a heart that finally healed rather than obeyed. Standing beside her was Evelyn, in a dress in the colors of Ashmark, which she had chosen for herself for the first time in her life. Beside them, Maeve was snoring. She'd fallen asleep standing up because she'd been guarding the gate all night and refused to leave. Behind them stood the peasants from the 6 villages: Olaf, Bertha, Oswald, who hadn't had a drink in 3 months, Tim, Meg, Graham with his family, Fergal, Bran, Molcha. They just stood there. Above the estate, in the morning sky, the threads of kinship were weaving together: gold, silver, copper, and dozens of thin new ones, to every person, to every home, to every patch of land that had begun to breathe anew. Dan looked at them, at everyone, and he thought of Mrs. Kobayashi, who, in another world, had cried for the first time, of the fact that he hadn't had time to write it down, of the fact that his last thought before death hadn't been about himself. The land of Underline had chosen him for that, because at the moment when it all ended, he was thinking of someone else. He understood that. He finally understood. And standing on the porch of his house, surrounded by people who had come of their own accord, he did what he always did. He turned to Leanne and asked, "How are you today?" Leanne looked at him. She smiled, quietly, genuinely, and she answered, "Fine." Morning was breaking over the Ashford house. Ahead lay the prince, the council, and a war that might not be a war after all. Ahead lay a world that needed to be changed. But that was for later. Right now, it was morning. The broth was simmering on the stove. Bertha was calling everyone to the table, and everything was fine.